So, topics we will cover today. So, what is a medical device? There are some definitions of a medical device, and specifically, what is software as a medical device, things that are and aren't. We need to talk about risk classification because this starts to drive how you should develop the software, the level of effort you take. We should talk about what are the pertinent regulations and what are the standards that we follow. Because there are specific things to be done for regulatory compliance. A little bit about UK and EU regulatory infrastructure, but this will be subject to change. As some of you might know, post-Brexit, the UK is a little bit different in its regulatory methodologies than the rest of the EU, and actually it's making the UK a little bit behind the EU and the US in many ways. So we expect something to change by next year, by next July. But even yesterday in the budget, there's some announcement about the way the MHRA is going to be funded and the different ways that it might go for the UK. So it's worth talking about that a little bit. Then perhaps a little break, and then we get into, after all of that information about the technicalities of medical device software, what is a quality management system? How does it fit into the regulations, and some funny acronyms, UDI and UDAMED, what that's all about. As I said before, the next part is nearly at the bottom of the agenda. The next part is about what do software developers need to know about intended use and the clinical development life cycle. So one of the things we're very keen on at Hardian, why we talk about having the full presentations and performing things holistically, is because we really see problems when different parts of a development of a medical device, including a software one, are done in isolation from each other. So particularly with software, for some reasons we'll go into, what we call the software development life cycle and the parallel clinical development life cycle are very much in lockstep, and really for success, you need to see it that way. You need to see it holistically. And then we talk about post-market surveillance a little bit, post-market clinical follow-up or performance follow-up. That's a language thing we'll get into, which is all about what do you do when now your device is on market, certified on market, hooray, have a champagne moment, but then what do you need to be prepared to do to keep it on market? As Rosie said, we would prefer then, because there's so many people here, to have any questions come up in the chat, which we're monitoring. Is just easier to see than the hand up function in Zoom, I think, when there are many people. What I'd also like to do is make this as interactive as possible, because you don't want to hear Karen Deep and me witter on for 3 hours. Please do be prepared to ask questions, and we'll try and answer as we go along and do a few exercises and use cases as we go along to hopefully put things into more context. So having said that, before I go on, is there any question or comment anyone would like to make or put in the chat now? I know HDR asked for people to ask sort of questions and things to cover previously when you registered, which we tried to do, but is there anything that anyone would like to put in the chat right now about a specific point that we might cover as we go along? So please do so. So, definitions. Small writing, not necessarily to read all at once now. You're going to get this material after the event today. But the first thing we've got to get to is the fact that in different jurisdictions, let's talk particularly about the EU, the UK at the moment, and the US, the definition of a medical device is different. So highlighted in the colors, 3 interesting things. Number one is probably you're here doing this today, so you don't need to be told that software in itself is defined as a medical device. And in the primary EU definition, it says software. It doesn't in the US, but we'll come on to that. So software can itself be a medical device. The second thing we need to talk about is in vitro diagnostic devices, which are to an extent their own thing. And I'm noticing already we're getting a question, thank you, Ellie Harwich, about in-house exemptions and what that means. So maybe we'll cover that quite now, because I think we haven't really got a hook for it later, but when I've given the definitions, we'll talk about that, I think. So that's a really good question, something we are interested in working with clients in. And the third one, just for fun, just put it there, is if you read the definitions, the European definition of medical devices, it's all about humans. It says use for human beings. If you look in the US definition, medical devices also cover the veterinary space. It says for in man or other animals. So that's interesting. Not sure if it's relevant to anyone. You're just saying this is some of the nuances of definition. And as we say at the bottom right, as you can see, we've highlighted the word in black, intended purpose, as we'll keep coming back to throughout this. All of this is nuanced about your intended use of a device. So being a bit more specific about what is software as a medical device, I think the best piece of text to explain it is one of the recitals of the EU medical device regulation. Should put at the top there. It is necessary to clarify that software in its own right, when specifically, again, intended by the manufacturer to be used for medical purposes set out in the previous slide, it's a medical device. While software for general purposes, then you can read the rest. And then you look at the US, it's not in their primary regulation, but secondarily, they mention, oh yes, and software is also can be a medical device. So in our watch out things at the right, so a few things. Software can be a device or an accessory. There's a subtlety to that, which we'll talk about a bit more in classification. And let me give you an example. An Apple Watch is not a medical device. Apple have an arrhythmia detector, which many people know about. It'll start saying to your heart's acting a bit strange through its the sensors on the back. Go and see your doctor. Samsung do the same thing for their version of an Android watch. That particular piece of software is a medical device, though the watch itself isn't. Again, and then it goes back to intended use, because the arrhythmia detector. And then you see, if you take that example a bit further, when you use the heart rate device in your Apple Watch in the gym, going running, whatever, for exercising, you're elevating your heart rate. Are you getting the exercise you need? That is not a medical purpose. So if you look at the left, I talk about lifestyle or well-being purposes. That is not a device. But as soon as now we apply a medical purpose to say, well, actually, what this is doing is helping people watch out for have they got a heart arrhythmia and they need to go and see a doctor, that has suddenly become a device. Now, why could that be? We come back to intended use, as we talked about. This particular bit of an intended use that, by the way, is a spoiler towards the end. If you stay towards the end, we'll talk a lot more about intended use right at the end. We have a foreseeable misuse situation. Your consumer who's got their Apple Watch has now got a thing on their wrist where they say, you know what, I don't need to go and get heart checkups because my watch is going to tell me when I've got a problem. Now, how accurate is it and what can it tell them? We'll come back to that point about classification and misuse again a little later. Does that prompt any other questions? Okay, there are two questions particularly, which you could all see in the chat. First one said, Ellie Harwich, I'll get onto that one now. I'll be interested to understand a bit more about the parameters of in-house exemption. This is really coming from the in vitro diagnostics space. So written in the regulations, if you read it exactly, in-house exemptions can only really be applied to diagnostics, not devices. So think of what is a medical device. If we well, think about what is a diagnostic, something where you take a blood sample, stool sample, urine sample, tissue biopsy, and do a test on it. If what you are doing is taking a sample and say in your general practice of medicine, your argument is this is just a medicine thing, it's a thing that doctors do in their hospital, then in-house exemption is a thing. If what you do is you say, we're an NHS trust and we have a lab and we've got this thing that we are doing, and actually what we want to do, say, is to provide it to other trusts or to provide it to our private patients, that is not an in-house exemption necessarily. There's a nuance. The MHRA for the UK, and I'm presuming that question is really UK-centric, say two things. Number one, in-house exemptions, they'll apply it to all medical devices, even though the regulations don't specifically say that. Number two, they are very clear that a few things, an in-house thing, in-house exemption, making something that's in effect a medical device, but not really going through the work to certify it, is something you can do if it's a service within an NHS trust that you're already providing to your patients. If it's something that you think that your wet lab can do, and you're going to provide it to private patients or other trust patients, but not necessarily to the patients of your own trust first, then there is no exemption. You get it certified. And why is that? It's because the definition of being a manufacturer of a medical device is someone who does something and places it on the market. Why in the NHS is market relevant? That's probably obvious in the case of the private patients and the private hospitals, that you're actually selling something to a company, selling a service or selling a medical device product. In the case of an NHS trust, each trust is its own legal entity. The NHS as a whole isn't a legal entity, isn't treated like a corporation or a company. Each trust is its own. So strictly speaking, if you provide a service for another trust, you're selling from one sort of company to another. Does that answer that particular question? So whilst we're waiting for the answer about the in-house exemption question, Ramesh, particularly interested in mental health software, as often guidance given, medical device and literature can be around physical health. Not strictly true. There is literature about mental health, and what normally happens in mental health is you're either doing a screening. So, well, actually, let's come on to that in the next slide, because that might make things clear on this space, or next after. This is just a bit of a reminder. Again, you can see this in the notes afterwards. A very, very simple flowchart of decision tree to say, have you got a device or not? Is the software something that's specifically listed in the MDR as a medical device? Or does it drive or influence the use of a device? Is the software something performing an action on data beyond storage archival? All those things there. So what the first one is saying, is the software itself something on a specific list? And let me give you an anecdote now. Karandeep and I worked a year or two ago on a device which is for cryolipolysis. It's for breaking up fat, reducing fat by cooling skin tissue and heating, but cooling skin tissue primarily. That's an Annex 16 thing. Why is that? It is not a medical device per se, because that sort of thing is more like a cosmetic treatment. It's not really having a medical purpose, but it is listed specifically because of the risk of using that device. There are clinical risks. For instance, what happens if the control system for such a thing that chills your skin goes wrong and you get too cold? You can get a necrosis, like a frostbite injury from it. What happens if it also heats you and it gets too hot? You get a heat burn on tissue. So there are specific things to watch out for as well in all the nuances of what's a device and isn't, that don't necessarily have a medical purpose, but they are treated in the regulations as if they do, because of the things that could go wrong with them: intended use and foreseeable misuse, including things that could go wrong. The next thing we often hear about is, well, we have a piece of software on the web, we're aggregating data from different sources. So go back to the Apple Watch, data from a watch, data from other wearables and things. Does that make that software on the web a device? Or even aggregating data from a piece of hardware that you create for a specific purpose. Like we've had projects to do with things like dermatology. We use a dermatoscope, a special sort of camera with a polarizing system for the image to look at skin lesions to see if there's cancer, looking at things like breath analysis, see what's in the breath of an individual. Those things to us are, those sensors are obviously devices. And even then, going back to the Apple Watch, the blood flow sensor. Now, in the piece of software on the web, is it just displaying a waveform that a clinician has to interpret through their training and decide what to do with? Not necessarily a device. Is that on the web saying, well, actually doing a triage or prioritization function, you should look at this person sooner than this other person because of something in this person's signal, something looks a bit strange? That's called CAT, computer assisted triage. So that is starting to be a device. Are you looking at the signal and saying, in this waveform, we detect this feature, you need to look at this? That's CAD-E, computer-aided detection. Very definitely a device. Does your software on the web say, we are looking at this feature, and because of this piece of information, we think the patient has this particular condition? That's CAD-X, computer-aided diagnostics. Very, very definitely a device. The last bit, does it benefit individual patients? So that's where you back out of that. If you're using this software that I just said for research, you're not really there for the clinical care of the patient. You're there to discover something, and not necessarily a device, but the context of the research can lead to a different regulatory framework. So no, if it's benefiting individual patients, you're really going to use the output, then it is a device. Lots of new messages coming up. So let's go on to the next slide. So mental health software, often given is guidance is given re medical devices in the literature can be around physical health. Great, this is a really good segue into this slide. With software as a medical device, if you look at this matrix, 3x3 matrix is a way of classifying things. Now, we start at the top, the horizontal one, where we go low, medium, and high. Are you informing clinical management? So if a piece of a software as a medical device is doing something like a PHQ-9 GAD score, and it's transmitting it to a clinician, going back to my previous case, if the clinician can see the entire questionnaire, and it's quite a simple set of questions, and the way you calculate it is quite simple, you can do it in your head. So they see the entire questionnaire, the entire answers of the patient, it's not necessarily a device. If it starts saying the patient is in a particular range of these scores, or even starts making a slightly more complex calculation that aggregates the scores of PHQ and GAD, or something like this, then it starts informing clinical management. What it's saying is it's making its own calculation, which is not necessarily transparent to the clinician. You're informing clinical management. If you're starting to say that you are, with these scores, saying there's an immediate action to be taken with the patient, a relatively real-time action, then you're driving clinical management, because now the software is indicating and the clinicians or whoever could actually believe entirely what the software says and go and do it, you're driving clinical management. If the software says, because the score is at this level, therefore there's a particular mental health clinical condition, you're diagnosing. If the software goes on to applying CBT, ACT, any sort of digitized version of therapy, you're treating. So a roundabout way of saying yes, mental health is covered. And even we have something called the Borderline Manual, which we refer to, that's published by the EU, that says where there are these grey area cases, should something be a device or shouldn't it? There is a very, very clear part in there that says if you are applying CBT, and it could be any type of similar therapy, ACT or anything, where you're actually claiming to treat and improve someone's mental health condition, you're a medical device. So I hope from that explanation of informing, driving and treating or diagnosing, that becomes more clear. Whilst we're on that subject, let's talk about what's non-serious, serious or critical means. Very roughly speaking, non-serious, a condition or something that's reversible. Serious, not. Critical, let my clinical colleagues make a better definition of critical. Again, all of these things, the informing, driving, treating or diagnosing, critical, serious and non-serious, there are formal definitions of these that we fall back to when we are working out classification with a client. And this is what everyone should be doing. Then what the EU says is there's a classification scheme where we call devices class 1 in Roman, class 2A, class 2B, class 3. The US system is slightly different. They call it class 1, class 2 and class 3 and often use Arabic numbers, not Roman. So that's why you can tell sometimes subtly whether it's a US or an EU UK classification. They basically say the same thing, that in this 3x3 matrix, there will be a classification depending on what your device is supposed to do. Back to what I said earlier, watch out, it's all about intended use. Karandeep, anything to say whilst I'm just scrolling through the next comments, see if I'm missing anything?
Nothing further to add. I've just been monitoring the questions. It seems some of the questions are going to be dealt with on later slides, so we can bring them up later on.
Okay, great. So where did I get to? How do you set up usability studies for software as a medical device? Perhaps we'll get back to that one a bit later when we talk about risk. Spoiler for that, there are two types of usability we normally talk about, formative and summative. Are you informing your design? So asking people's opinion about, is the font big enough? Can you understand that language that we're using? Are the little cartoons and things actually making sense? Does the flow through the software make sense to you? That's formative. Do loads of that as much as you can. And that doesn't have to be reported to anyone, doesn't need any ethical or any other approval, as long as it is purely usability. You are not actually, as an outcome of that, changing someone's clinical pathway. Then we talk about summative, which you do at the end. We'll talk about risk analysis towards the end. The point being that a summative usability analysis says, if you found through your risk analysis that there are any particular risk mitigations, so things to prevent, person's condition becoming more non-seriously wrong or seriously wrong or critically wrong, and for that risk control measure to be effective, so for it to work, there's a human factor involved, then you consider summative usability evaluation. You create a test with a representative cohort of intended users that says, we are going to train you to use the device. Then you have to use it yourself, and we're going to watch you do these critical operations and see, basically on a statistical basis, how many mistakes are made, or how well, hopefully, this cohort can actually use the device, how well the training has worked, how well the risk mitigation features have worked. To come back to that, that's usability. Mixing hardware and software to achieve a functionality like the Apple Watch and its sensors. How do you draw the line between having purely software as a medical device, having hardware itself? Well, that's, I think we started on that earlier. So thank you for that question. That's the start. If you have the sort of sensor that is on a consumer product, like the heart rate sensors on an Apple Watch, for instance, yeah, that's not a device because it's got its own purpose for it. It's only the software that adds to it to be a device. If, however, I've given you a couple of other examples, an optical dermatoscope. So it's a camera with a special polarizing filters to look at people's skin to see if you can see well enough lesions on the skin to try and determine cancer. That is in itself a medical device because there is a definition that you are using visible light as a type of energy that you're adding to a person to look at something. If you are using anything but visible light, so you're using laser or something, so number one, there isn't going to be probably a consumer product. You're doing something very specific for medical purpose, it becomes a device. Again, in the optical dermatoscope thing, there is an idea with some folks that you could use the camera on a smartphone. Is the camera good enough? So this is a gray area. It's a really gray area. And then the question we have to ask with the thing about the clinical development, software development life cycle that we'll talk about later is actually, can you really see the type of lesion with the camera on a phone? However great the camera is, an iPhone 14 or the Android Samsung equivalent, can you actually see these things with that sort of camera? Why did people invent polarized light dermatoscopes in the first place? Then we come on to other sorts of sensors that we've used. Things like when you analyze someone's breath, think along the lines like a breath tester for drunk driving, the ones the police use out on the road. When using that example as something that you put inside the body orifice, inside a mouth, then it becomes a medical device. There isn't a real consumer purpose for it, but it becomes a medical device because you're worrying about biocompatibility. So it's the material made of something that isn't going to cause a problem with the patient or the user, things like that. So I think the big answer there is it depends, and it depends the nuances you can apply. Hope that helps. What's next? Right, so there's a question from Bearhow, excuse me if that's a bad pronunciation of your name. Thank you so much for the webinar, pleasure. Important question regarding software plus hardware. I mean, medical device with software, rehabilitation plus sensor for data acquisition, and a board connected via Bluetooth. Notified body did not accept to certify the overall system, but allowed to certify only the software in class 2A as standalone. The notified body obliged us to speak about accessories. Okay, very nice segue to the next slide. Talked about Apple Watches, but I prepared this slide before, and looking at this idea of classification before, if you could map what you're talking about on this example, say of a digital thermometer. So by the way, that thermometer has SIMD, not SAMD, software in a medical device. There's some software in it to drive that display. That's by the by, we're talking about SAMD today, software as a medical device. So great, the digital thermometer with its SIMD does something. So maybe it's got a Bluetooth or wired, let's call it Bluetooth for the sake of this example, connection to a phone. Well, number one thing, let's just talk about the thermometer and the hardware and why the notified body said something, that it's an accessory, it's separate. Can the thermometer, or the thermometer has a medical purpose in its own right? Because it's specifically for measuring temperature to use in diagnosis or treatment. It's not like having a thermometer on the wall in the house. which hasn't got a medical purpose. So that is it in itself a medical device, that thermometer. So that's one piece of certification that's needed. That will be a class 1 medical device normally. Now we look at the software. Class 2A means, if you look in the matrix again, you're informing or driving clinical management for either a non-serious or a serious situation. So now it's a class 2A in 4 circumstances on that matrix. But why is it a class 2A? What are the circumstances? So if you look at the right and say, watch out, somebody can be its own thing or an accessory. Is that software just by itself informing clinical management? So is it a way of displaying the temperature and maybe a graph of the temperature, putting a trend on it? And are you then saying to the clinician, dear clinician, because you know all about temperature, you've got some idea of the history of this patient, temperature is just helping, your trend and temperature is just helping you to think what you will do for the patient. Is the software, though, driving clinical management? Is it saying, because your temperature has reached 39.5 degrees, and this is really important now, and because of other things that the software may know, so care pathway advice, it says 39.5, you need to do something. So you know, starting to rely on that Sandy to remind you to do something, but still as a clinician, you know enough about the case to decide what that something is. Are you driving clinical management? Third one is where you get a fusion of inputs. So temperature on its own isn't going to tell you something about the diagnosis, but if that software is taking your temperature and it's got some other inputs like manually entered patient data, patient reported data of their own, some other sensors, something from the automatically scraping the health record of that patient, are you now in a position where you think the software can provide a diagnosis? Which actually then, if it's a non-serious condition, keeps you in class 2A. If it's a serious condition, takes you to class 2B, if you look at the matrix. So perhaps that's where your notified body is coming from. Then I say, is it an accessory? So it goes back to an accessory means, again, with the thermometer example, the thermometer can have a medical purpose of its own, and perhaps you just use the phone as a convenience to display the readings and perhaps, you know, do again a trend and informing a trend graph, which you could have done by reading the display and writing it down, or even, you know, putting the numbers in Excel periodically and drawing a graph. Then it could be an accessory, because all you're doing is helping to use that thermometer for its original purpose, which is just displaying temperature at a specific point in time. If, however, the things I said before about you start being a bit more analytical with the data and you start enriching the information through algorithms in the software, whether they be AI, which is a big buzzword, whether they be decision trees, whether they be simple calculations, then it's a device in its own right, if that's making sense. Next bullet point, which is important, then, is now that app for a clinician or a lay user. This is really important about, again, we go back to the last point, intended use, recurring theme. Part of intended use, who is your intended user? If it's a lay user, so a patient at home, say, or perhaps when the phone app tells them something, they'll just go and do it because they haven't been trained for so many years in the medical school to know any different, to be able to question. Or if it's for a clinician, depending on how much information you do and don't give them, they could question and override what the software is suggesting. The big point we're trying to make here is your classification goes up a notch if your intended user is a lay user, a patient, because they don't necessarily know enough to override what the software is saying. But having said that as well, if the software is aimed at generalists or nurses, something that's not particularly specialized, perhaps that thought process has to happen as well to say, does that particular level of clinician know enough, or is trained well enough, is going to be experienced enough to be able to challenge what the software is saying? Just like if there's a case conference and two clinicians are challenging each other's opinion, can a clinician challenge, frankly, the opinion that the software is giving? Hoping that helps with that particular question about why the notified body asked you to speak about accessories, to say, are you really having an accessory, or are you having a device in its own right? Next one, measuring function in SAMD is applied. All right, so again, maybe the thermometer example, not so much. But maybe if you're doing an automated analysis of an image, a 2D image, a heart image or something, and you're measuring the size of a heart chamber, the question is, if the clinician is expecting to see something in a unit such as millimeters, how are you calibrating? How do you determine that that's the millimeters is correct? The simplistic answer is there is a translation from the size of pixel, depending on the optical chain. And by the way, I used to do this in a previous life. I used to actually develop software for automated measurements on images when I was way back when I was more of a software engineer than a person who talked about subjects like we're talking about today. Is how do you know that if you say 1.0 millimeters plus or minus 0.01 millimeters, so a measurement and a tolerance, how do you know that that measurement is correct? How do you know what actually the size of a pixel is, how you're magnifying through any distortions? So the important point there is calibration and reference to national standards. I'll tell you how we did it way back when. Don't know how people do it now. We'd have a tungsten piece in the X-ray field of a known dimension, which we measured as well. It's on the same plane as the thing we're measuring. So we measured that first. Every single image, you'd measure that piece of tungsten and say, well, if that, depending on the local conditions, if the power of the X-ray or something goes up or down a bit, the image will appear different. It'll appear to focus differently. Then we have a piece that's been measured, and that measurement's been made against a national standard that we use every time. Techniques like this need to be applied if you're measuring linear dimensions, volumes, something like this, anything that can be an SI unit or equivalent unit. Okay, so then you said sensors and the board were considered accessories. Well, yeah, and again, it depends. What is your product claim? That's an interesting point. Again, looking at the example on the screen of the phone software and the thermometer, which is the primary device and which is its accessory? You can look at it two ways. The thermometer, because it's got a display and you can use it in its own right for medical purpose as the primary device. The phone is an accessory because it helps you see the data remotely, say. It helps use that device. If actually your whole claim is about what the software on the phone can do, and then say not a thermometer, say if you imagine that thermometer without a display on it, you use a sensor to read something, but that sensor in itself can't tell you anything. There's no display on it. It has to transmit something to the hardware, the phone that's running the software. The software is a medical device, then that's the accessory. It's all about intended use. Okay, so then the next question from Anup Shah. Software devices developed in one trust employed another part of a pre-specified research collaboration. Does it still count as in-house? Well, that's rather interesting. By research, I take it you mean you've got ethics approval to go and do something and find something out. There's a protocol with an endpoint. You want to discover something. That's research. It's not a device. If you are using it, again, for an intended use, an intended medical purpose, you're actually going to use the outcome of what it says for patient care, then it's either already a device that's certified or you have what we call a clinical investigation. You are trying to find out if a device or something that you want to be certified as a device really works. That will come on to a bit later, but it's a much bigger subject. But what we would say is the specific question of software is used in one trust and deployed in another as part of research, then there's a whole other thing we're not really covering today. But if the point of the research is doing something like with efficacy, finding out the efficacy of drugs or something, then actually your software is potentially a tool that's facilitating the research. So it comes with a whole other thing. Regime of the European Medicines Agency and the US FDA and the MHRA in the UK saying, not that it's a medical device because, you know, it's either informing, driving, or treating or diagnosing a patient at that time, but you are relying on the result of that software to inform what you're going to do with a therapy, something different. So it's got its own set of rules. About again, that's not really what we're covering today. Perhaps that's another question entirely that you could come back to us on another time. So is it possible to certify rehabilitation systems, software, hardware using Rule 11? This is really difficult to understand. So hoping that if we're talking, when people say Rule 11, for those who aren't knowing, that is alluding to the European Union medical device regulation that basically says what this matrix is on the screen. So then we come back to the question, I'll reflect the question back. Are you treating with the rehabilitation system? The software part would be Rule 11. Is there really a hardware element? What's the hardware element? Is it an accessory to make the software work? Is it something different? So I hope that what I said before starts to cover that question. Next one. Mariam, hi. You have not mentioned any class 1 devices. Is there a reason for this? I understand on the UK MDR, we are still allowed to have class 1 SAMD. Yeah, so let's have a bit of history. The UK medical device regulation, the UK MDR, is based on the EU medical device directive that went out of use in 2021. The EU medical device directive was written 30 something more years ago, where SAMD was not a thing. In fact, that it was only in the 5th Amendment to that, which is in the 2000s, that they really started to talk about software as medical device. So the concept of treating with software, the concept of many things with software, was not even envisaged in the original directive. This is why class 1 SAMD is still possible in the UK. This is coming on to something I said earlier, that the regulations are due to change in 2024, July 2024. It's delayed from July 2023. The MHRA and the government haven't had time to get their act together to fully propose a new regulation. What we believe is that the UK regulation will turn more into what you see on the screen, this sort of classification. So class 1 will not be happening, except in some very few cases. Why do we say that? Because if you look, there are some exceptions in the US, but if you look the way the US does it pretty much this way. If you look at the EU, they do it this way. So it makes the UK an anomaly in being able to trade. So people make the argument, yeah, it makes it too difficult. It makes it too difficult to develop things and deploy in the UK because you're up classifying and go, really? So then that's great if your market is big enough with actually Great Britain, so 60 odd million people. But if you want to trade in the EU, if you want to trade in the US, you really need to be looking at a higher class. So yeah, we don't. In the work that we do at Hardian Health, there is virtually no class 1 software. Why? Because a lot of our clients want to do something about that will translate to the EU. A lot of them want to see opportunities in the US. And that means a lot of what we do is class 2 and above. And that's why there's bias towards that perhaps in our presentation. Hoping that helps, but please feel free to add some other question or something in the chat. Okay, role of regulators versus notified bodies. You've got the pleasure of Karandeep mentioning that. There's a couple of slides on that later. So you don't have to listen to me all morning. And Andrew, oh, see, Karandeep answered that already. Terrific. Ramesh, what you're asking, you have not mentioned it. Yes. Okay, how come there are mental health class 1 devices and which do take questionnaire measures and prepare these scores to users, for example? I think it's the same reason. The MDD, so the European Union, if they're deployed in the EU, they're under MDR Rule 120, which says if you got it, if you got something in under the old class 1 regime by the 25th of May 2021, you've got some time period in which to upgrade it to a class 2. You can keep it as a class 1 as long as it doesn't make there's no significant change, which I think as well, Candy will come on to what significant change means. What the EU has recently said is expanded on those rules because of other reasons. I think you'll talk about notified body bandwidth later. But basically, you get a time limit of about 2028 to change it. If you are now to produce a new device that hasn't been previously certified, then you've got to think, if it's for the UK, you could get it in as class 1 now and have 3 or 5 years, depending on what the MHRA make their mind up afterwards, to change it to a class 2 if the UK goes this way. If it's a new device for the EU that hasn't been previously certified, it's what it says on the screen. It's going to start at class 2A. So that helps, Ramesh. Can you kindly indicate from Shyama, can you kindly indicate which category an AI-driven remote symptom checker application that gathers symptoms from patients remotely for a GP receptionist for appointment booking purposes might fall? That is a super gray area. Well, it's not that gray because I think we have an answer because there have been devices done for that. Think about this. What I said earlier about a lay user, what's already on the screen. The receptionist is a lay user. Are you telling the receptionist that just that someone needs to be prioritized because of their conditions? So now we look into foreseeable misuse. What happens if you tell someone that says someone ought to be prioritized, but actually someone who ought to be prioritized because of inaccuracy in the system is not prioritized? They fall to the bottom of the queue. The receptionist prioritizes someone else. So would their condition be non-serious, serious? Where would it be as a result of that, what we call foreseeable misuse? So for the umpteenth time, the bottom right point, and we always say it, intended use, a recurring theme. What do you intend specifically, that information that you've remotely transmitted, with the intended user being the receptionist, what do you intend to do with it? So we will go, are there guidelines to design experiments specific requires the analytical performance? Yes. Yes, there are. Perhaps we'll have time to come later or another time. And Shyama, oh, you're going back to the point we were talking about just now. Yes, to prioritize appointments. Well, yeah, the question is not the appointment you prioritize. That would be a false, that would be a true positive if you had prioritized properly. Then we have to talk about what are the false negatives, things like this, a whole other topic. All right, now realizing we've been going on for nearly an hour, we want to give you a bit of a break because we've talked a lot and hopefully not getting to too much cognitive overload. So let's just see where we are. Again, you'll get this later, so please review this later, not to dwell too much. We have a whole question about medical device classification we talked about there, and then specifically with software, there's another level of classification that we need to consider. And what this talks about is that software could go wrong, but you could have what we call a risk control measure external to software. So again, this point about if you tell a clinician something with software, what can you do to mitigate the risk that the software is wrong? So you tell a clinician something like, someone's got this particular condition, you're either diagnosing it or you're driving the management to say, well, actually, it looks like they may have something, but actually a test needs to be performed to make sure. That's a healthcare procedure outside of the software, which mitigates the risk of the software being wrong. Note that says healthcare procedure, not professional, because the point there being that someone who's reading the output of the software might be biased with automation bias, and you just do what the software says. But what we're saying is there needs to be some sort of independent procedure to mitigate the risk. And just here to say, without reading in great detail, the US looks at it slightly differently. So again, we have to look at the intended use and decide how to classify because of the subtle difference if you want to go to the US market and how they say software risk should be handled. At that note, my throat's really dry. Everyone's ears are probably really ringing, and perhaps it's time for a break. Rosie, what should we say? 10 minutes?
Yeah, Mike, 10 minutes sounds good.
10 past to make a round number. It says 9:57 on my clock.
Sounds fine.
Great. Thank you for your attention and the great questions so far, everyone. And we'll let Karen Deep speak after 10 minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to sit back for a while, and Karen Deep will now take you through the next segment.
Perfect. So when it comes to medical devices, what are the main regulations that we have? We have the UK, EU, and USA. Now, there are different regulations worldwide, but often what you will find is that majority of them either mimic or either in line with the EU and the US regulations. So if you target these three jurisdictions, often that covers you for most of the world. So there's two sides of it because we're talking about software here. There's the medical device regulations that you have. We've also got things like data protection and cybersecurity because using software, these things are connected to online systems, etc. So there's two different considerations here. And of course, in the UK, we have the UK Medical Device Regulation, UK MDR 2002. That is effectively a carbon copy, more or less, of the old EU Medical Device Directive. Now, there's a small mistake there. It says that the UK is currently working on a new regulation in July 2023. That's now been changed to 2024, for whatever reason that might be. Now, in terms of data protection, in the UK, we have the Data Protection Act, but we also have the UK GDPR, which is more or less a copy of the EU GDPR, effectively. So there are two things that we have to deal with. Now, in the EU, of course, we have the EU MDR, Medical Device Regulation. And then, of course, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And there's also a proposed AI regulation as well, which I've not seen anything about recently. And then, of course, in the US, we have the FDA. And then, of course, we have HIPAA. We think of it HIPAA as like the GDPR version, but for the US. But it's also important to know that the US also has state laws. So, for example, California has a Consumer Privacy Act. So if you are thinking of targeting the USA, be aware that the different states may have different laws within them. And that's something that you need to comply with. Next slide, Mike. Perfect. So what are the minimum standards that should be followed by a software medical device or a software in a medical device? Now, overall quality management is, of course, ISO 13485, which is quality management systems for medical devices. Now, ISO 13485 is effectively ISO 9001, but for medical devices. Now, ISO 9001 can be applied to many different industries. It could be construction sites, it could just be general offices, etc. 13485 is the tailored version of 9001 to medical devices. Now, ISO 14971 is the risk management standard to medical devices. So if you want to apply risk management to medical devices, it's 14901. And then, of course, we have 80002-1 which is basically a guidance on the application of ISO 14971. And I've not listed that here, but there's also ISO 24971, which is basically a guidance on how to apply ISO 14971. So those are the general quality management and risk management standards. Now, you may see the terms BSEN or EN on these, and I'm going to touch on to that later. Some of you may already know what that is, but for those of you who don't, that's something I'm going to touch on to. Now, software as a medical device and software in a medical device, or health software in general, what are the kind of standards we need to apply? So there's 82304, which is health software. There's 82304-2, which is basically health and wellness apps, which is what a lot of software devices fall into. Of course, there's 62304, which is medical device software, so software development lifecycle. We have 62366, which is basically usability engineering to medical devices. I think somebody in the chat here earlier did mention, how do we apply usability engineering to medical devices? This is a standard that we use for that. ISO 15223. So often when you look at a medical device, if you look at a traditional medical device, it has a label on there. Often there's a lot of symbols. If you don't know what those symbols mean, it's 15223. But what's interesting about a software medical device is still required to have a label. So if you ever use a software medical device, often if you go to the about section or the settings or something like that, you would basically see what is a digital version of a label. So software medical devices still have labels on them. They're just not in physical form. And then, of course, we have 20417, which is medical devices information to be supplied by the manufacturer, things like information for use, user manuals, etc. So these are the minimum standards. Now, depending on what your product is, and if there's a physical element to it, and depending on what the indications are, what areas it's targeting, there may be additional standards. Now, it's important to understand standards are not mandatory. Regulations are mandatory. They're two different things, a regulation and a standard. However, standards are best practices and they often align with regulations. So it's highly recommended to use a standard. And if you're not going to use a standard, you need to have a good reason as to why that is. Next slide, Mike. Perfect. So the UK regulatory infrastructure. So post-Brexit now, the UK is no longer part of the EU, of course. So previously we used to have a CA mark. We now have what's known as UKCA, so UK Conformity Assessment. So how exactly do you get this mark? So the national governance is the competent authority, which in the UK is the MHRA. And then through that, we have approved bodies. So the MHRA appoints approved bodies. What do I mean by that? So if you are if you're above a class 1, apart from sterile measuring or a reusable device, you appoint an approved body. What is an approved body? Companies like BSI, SGS, UL, etc., that come and effectively audit you and then give you that UKCA mark. So they will come down to audit you, look at your technical files, do a quality management review on you, and then it goes through, and then effectively goes for the vendor. So you can see it starts from the top down. So the MHRA appoint approved bodies then look at companies, etc., and then the product gets released onto the market. Next slide, Mike. Now too fast. One before, perfect. So the EU regulatory infrastructure, you can see is very similar. Of course, we got the EU governance, and then we have the national governance. So depending on which country you are in the EU, each and every EU country will have its own competent authority. So think of it, each and every country in Europe will have their own version of the MHRA, wherever you're operating. And then we have notified bodies. Now, look at the terms. So there's notified bodies and approved bodies. Now, more or less, they're exactly the same thing. An approved body is allowed to give UKCA. A notified body can give you an EU CE mark. That's the differences between the two. Now, a question some of you may have, can the same companies be approved and notified bodies at the same time? Yes. SGS, BSI, DECRA are currently both approved bodies and notified bodies. And then it goes down. So you can see that the EU regulatory infrastructure is more or less the same. It's just the terminology that we use is slightly different. And then, of course, there's different competent authorities depending on which country you intend to operate in. Next slide, please. So regulatory pathway, what does the regulatory pathway look like? So there is basically a four-stage approach. We have the fundamentals, we have development, and then we have deployment. And then the most important one is maintenance. A lot of companies make the mistake and think, okay, we have a UKCA mark, we can have a CE mark, you can sit back. Okay, you can relax a little, but there's a lot of activities that need to be done post-market. So we start off with the fundamentals effectively. So the most important one that Mike touched on to, and we're going to have a case study later on today as well, is the intended use. What does your device actually do? What are the intended indications? What are the claims? What are the use environments? Is this going to be used by professionals? Is this going to be used by lay users? If it's going to be used by professionals, do these people have the appropriate training? If it's going to be used by lay users, do these people need to be trained? Do your instructions for use need to be a little bit more clearer? So for example, if you have a device out there effectively that's made for, let's say, physicians, and this is going to be a physician, let's say a cardiologist who's got over 10 years experience, you can put technical jargon into the IFU and instructions that you have because they're going to understand that terminology. Now, if this is going to be used by somebody at home, they may not understand that terminology. So effectively, the intended use statement, as we're going to touch on later today, is effectively the backbone of your medical device. It shows you what that medical device actually is, what are the indications. And it's only then, once you've defined it, can you actually start building the technical files. Because if you start building your technical documentation without knowing what your device is, your technical documentation is not going to reflect the true use of your device, and it's not going to work. So the intended use statement is always the first thing that we do. And number two, of course, is documenting a regulatory strategy. Do you want to go for UKCA? Do you want to go for CE marking? Do you want to go to the US market? Now, a lot of companies make the mistake, and especially with the EU MDR situation, saying, you know what, if we go down the US 510K route, we can get onto the market in 6 months. That very well might be true, but have you looked at it from a health economics point of view? Don't go for what is easiest, but go to the market where you're going to have the most impact. That's the most important thing here. And then, of course, determine the device classes. You know, depending on the claims you make, your device might be a class 1 and maybe a class 2 and possibly even a class 3. What claims do you want to make and how do you want to go about it? So some companies out there, especially software ones, what they often did was the days of MDD and the current UK MDRs, they will create a class 1 version of their software, some of the features turned off, put it on the market, see how people react. Then as they're working in the background, come up with a V2 effectively, which is a class 2 or above, and then put that on the market. And then, of course, establishing the quality management system, that's important. And then, of course, technical documentation. So that's the fundamentals, effectively. That's the first thing that you need to do. Then, of course, we got the development. How do we go about developing the device? So effectively, we're going to have a clinical evaluation plan or a performance evaluation. For those who don't know the difference, clinical evaluation is what we do with a medical device. Performance evaluation is what we do with an in vitro diagnostic. So it's a difference in terminology there. Of course, then we've got risk management, software development, and of course, verification and validation. Now, this is an important one. A lot of people don't know the difference between verification and validation. So the difference is I'm going to explain to you. So as people can see, I'm wearing a jacket. So verification is, does this jacket have 2 holes for arms? Does it have buttons on there, etc. Validation is, does this jacket actually fit me? Is it actually fit for purpose? And is it doing what I need it to do? So that's the difference between verification and validation. And then, of course, we have deployment. So deployment is actually putting it out there. Once we're deploying it, obviously, we want to have what's known as post-market surveillance. How is this device going? So things like software. If you have a software, it's inevitable you're going to have some sort of bugs or fixes. We want to go out to the market and want to make sure what kind of bugs are happening. If these are just very minor things, we're not concerned. If these bugs are maybe issues with the algorithm and it's either giving false positives or false negatives, we want to look into that. So it's important that we have post-market surveillance in place. What do I mean by post-market surveillance? It could be speaking to physicians, speaking to end users, questionnaires. Now, the more proactive approach with post-market surveillance, look into things like literature, look into things like the FDA more database, and obviously UDAMED, which is the European system, is currently in the works. But, you know, go out to see what your competitors are doing, see what the modes of failures are, and make sure your device doesn't fall victim to that effectively. So that's what you want to have for post-market surveillance. How is this device performing? How is people reacting to it? And is it doing what it needs to do? And then you tweak it as necessary effectively. And then you can raise that either as feature request or problem reports. Next slide, please, Mike.
We put here a little pause. You didn't hear as much as in the previous section, but a little pause. We've got one question so far. I wonder if we should address that, and if anyone else would like to raise a question at the moment. We've got to a sort of a logical juncture in where we're talking about. So the question from Andrew Bennett was, where do CQC and MHRA approved body considerations overlap versus not, particularly for SAMD manufacturers? Okay, CQC is really about if you're offering a service. So you might be a SAMD manufacturer who is creating a product, something that's a medical device for use within your own office, offering a telehealth service or something, or for use in the field. There you would be overlapping between a manufacturer and someone who has to register with the CQC against the schedule to the regulation that says these are all the regulated activities of the CQC. Potentially those are medical device manufacturers. I'd have thought the majority of cases actually your customers who might be subject to CQC, not you yourself. So hopefully that very quickly helps. Right then, 62304, let's see. Oh, the questions are now coming. From VJ, 62304 Section 9 mandates problem resolution processes. It's similar to Vigilance System. It's part of it. Vigilance System is go and find out what's happening. So Vigilance is proactive and reactive. Karandeep mentioned both of those. Proactive vigilance, as he said to you, was about going out and seeing what your competitors doing, seeing what's going on in the market, see what might befall, what things can go wrong that might befall you, and dealing with them before they go wrong. Reactive vigilance is looking at your customers' feedback, their complaints, looking at that for other devices to an extent. Those are all inputs to problem resolution process. Problem resolution process is then the systematic triaging. How important is this potential problem? Impact analysis, what does it need to do? And we'll go into that a bit later. Impact analysis, what do we need to about it? As we're talking about something that has to be certified, part of impact analysis, again, a bit more later, is what then we have to do about re-verifying, revalidating. As Karandeep said, you know, your coat has got the right number of armholes and pockets in it. That's re-verifying it. Is it actually keeping you warm enough and things like this? That's revalidating it. Or at what level is your product changed so much you need to recertify it? So as I said, that's what it's part of it. Right, the next one, my CE certificate can be accepted in UK or I have to start a new process validation. I'm not sure, Erica, why you're saying particularly process validation. So let's unpack that a bit. My CE certificate can be accepted in UK. Well, for a while, the MHRA are making an exception that says as long as you've got your CE certificate, you can come onto the UK market under certain conditions, and you need a UK responsible person to be your interface. So a company like Hardian Health and like many others that are your official contracted liaison with the MHRA. When I say that, I'm making an assumption. I'm assuming, as you say, a CE certificate accepted in UK, you are a manufacturer from outside of the UK. Do I have to start new process validation? If by process validation, you actually mean conformity assessment, which means getting it certified for the UK, we believe what the MHRA is going to say next year, though it might change, is that if you've got a CE mark that was made under the old MDD, so before May 2021, you get 3 years after next July, before you have to change it to UKCA mark. We believe as well that if you've got an MDR or IVDR CE mark, it's a more recent one, you get 5 years. And at this point, I've got to mention an article in the Financial Times yesterday. I think it was Hugh, yeah, it was yesterday, where this press has turned this thing around of saying, what the UK might do is look at regulation, these certifications in other jurisdictions and say, well, if it's good enough, say for the US or for a CE mark, it's good enough for the UK. I would in SAMD express caution. There's a whole thing when we talk about clinical evaluation about bias that can be introduced into your systems because you're informing, driving, treating or diagnosing, often based on AI models, often based on clinical guidelines. So say the Royal College of Radiologists says one thing and the NICE guidelines say something like that in the UK. But now the American College of Radiologists says do another thing and a product from the US aligns to that. It might not work well in the UK market context. And certainly if you bring a product in, so say it's an AI product, deep learning that's been trained on a demographics in the US or somewhere else, and you bring it to the UK, it might have a bias because the population subgrouping and the prevalence of conditions might differ. For instance, as an example of that, because projects we've done in the past, I go back to the optical dermatoscope I mentioned earlier that Karandeep and I worked on, where you have something that looks at skin lesions, and that particular product on the Fitzpatrick scale, so scale of how dark the skin is from from African through to European sort of factors, it only worked in a certain lighter skinned population, so that doesn't translate well across the world. If you look at things like other things we looked on breast mammography, the density of breast tissue depends on ethnicity. So your imaging might react to it differently if you've trained it on a demographic that's biased in one direction to another direction. Not Afro-Caribbean, Black ethnicity is perhaps more prevalent in the US population, whereas in the UK population, you've got more South Asian. So it's looking at factors like that that doesn't let it translate very easily in the world we are in. So I don't know, Karandeep or even Hugh, you're there. Anything to say?
No, I think you summarized it quite well, Mike.
Right, so do you have a good example of a label for SAMD? We can have a look at one later. We'll whip one up. But if you're in the UK and if you still have on your phone the COVID-19 app from the NHS, that's a class 1 medical device. It's got an example of the label in it. Clinical investigation or clinical research during development. If you park that for a minute, Lene, if I completely mispronounced name, I apologize, then we're coming back to that later. Yeah, oh yes, Karandeep, you've mentioned the NHS app as well about the label.
Yep.
We're all on the same page.
But I think Brian's not based in the UK, so it might be that
Yeah.
he doesn't have access to. So what we do, Brian, as Mike said, we'll show you an example later on since you're not in the UK.
Well, just to whip one off the
Okay.
computer, take the presentation off screen and show you something else in a moment. Right, Andrew Bennett, question relates to forthcoming SAMD regulatory change. How do current rules deal with rapid continuous iteration? Right, you have got to be super careful with the idea of rapid change iteration. Number one, it talks a lot of companies about CI/CD. If you're a software engineer, you'll understand CI/CD is an acronym for continuous integration, and the D can be continuous delivery or continuous deployment. Continuous deployment means based on some automated testing and things, some automation, your product can get pushed onto the production servers and be out in the field. I suggest not really a thing in medical devices. Continuous delivery is a bit more practical. It means based on continuous delivery. So you are ready to push, but that last push has to be manual. We'll go on to software development lifecycle and why in the end and how to sign off. And the fact that, yes, having said that, you can perhaps automate certain parts of that workflow, but there has to be a bit of a manual intervention. There has to be a sign-off ritual of things. So I think that's perhaps part of the answer to your question. It's not about forthcoming regulatory change. It's about even now, because all what you're talking about is covered by the standard IC 62304 that Karandeep mentioned earlier. And that's not going to change. Well, it might be a new version that's a bit stronger about sort of more modern engineering techniques, but that and the risk management standards aren't really going to change. The predetermined change protocol is something we deal with a lot with people. So what that is saying is if you've got an automated AI, really, something that's self-learning, how do you know that how it's learning? How do you set some parameters to begin with how it's learning, and how do you know that it's going to change? What it's doing as it changes and it adapts. We translate that into regular software development lifecycle for all products by, and again, we come on to this a bit later, so all good segues, thank you, into how you have a strong change control process and figure out the things you need to figure out before you accidentally basically release something you shouldn't. So it's about change control, which is perhaps, as I've discovered, and being, the software engineer said in the past, it's something I've adapted to, is about the formality of change control that's required in the space that we're in. So Andrew, please do come back when we get to that bit and ask more questions if we're not completely covering it. So what does motion say? How to write design transfer clause in 13485 QMS for SAMD is there's no design yes, there is a design transfer for software. As I was just saying, you have got a development environment. that your developers are working in. You then need a test environment if your team is big enough to have independent or separate QA. So there's some test environment. You have then got a staging environment typically where you perform validation. It's the last bit of test before you go to production. Then you've got a production environment, which is you upload, say, to the app stores. So that's transfer. You're uploading to the app stores. You've got web backend database, which you upload onto your production servers on Amazon or Google or Azure or wherever. That's design transfer. The point being made there is that design transfer typically means, yeah, you've designed some physical stuff and now you create the drawings, the instructions to make it, and you send it to the workshop where it'll be physically built. The analogy in software is uploading from staging to production. The final push from staging to production is your design transfer, if that helps. There you go, Karen Deep. The next comment is, Karen Deep is quicker than me answering these questions when I'm talking about them. Academic researchers' approach developed doesn't typically utilize formal processes. Okay. Christopher Yao, there is a concept called technology readiness level, TRL. It was something developed by NASA, I think in the 60s, to understand how mature technology was for the space program. We can apply the same thing. There's been some work done to call it regulatory readiness level, some papers written, but we can apply the same concept to, I think, to what you're talking about. So technology readiness level is a scale from 1 to 9. 1 is very basic proof of principle. 9 is full production, mass use of your product. And what we say, and if we were to create the quality management system Karen Deep's talking about for you, we would have a design control procedure in it. And we would say that from TRL 1 to 3, you are not really doing all this formal stuff. What you're really doing is creating the customer requirements that go into the real products that starts at TRL 4. So then the question is, how do you as an organization customize your TRL for your own use and be able to make that argument? Because if you do get to being a class 2 or something, notified body, UK approved body will come and audit you and they'll go, oh, look at that project over there. That's interesting. Show me all the design controls for that. And you want to say to them, oh, no, that's basic research. That's not on the design control. And they say, really? How's that then? And the answer we would suggest you to give them is, here is our design control procedure. And here's where we've identified it's at TRL 1, 2, or 3. And therefore, all this stuff doesn't happen yet because our procedure says we start doing all this at TRL 4. Hoping that helps as an answer. Karen D?
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, we'll do the link towards the NHS software label in a bit. Whilst Karen Deep's talking next, I'll go and look for it, what we can show you. Can you oh, right. Oh, yes, that's true. I suppose, yes. So you're saying you can get the NHS app. Right, Erica White, my notified body is not the list you presented for UK. This is why I ask. Oh, right, Erica. Notified bodies are companies that are in the based in EU member states. UK approved bodies are companies that are based in the UK. The only overlap is this, is where a company creates a base in the other. So since Brexit, what has happened, or prior to Brexit to prepare, BSI, which is a British Standards Institution, a notified body based in England, they were a notified body. To continue to be allowed to be an EU notified body, they opened an office in Amsterdam. So actually, BSI UK approved body is in Milton Keynes, BSI notified body is in Amsterdam. It's the same company, really. TÜV SÜD, which is a company that I know very well, did a load of projects with them, are a notified body that's based in Berlin, but for many years they've had an office in Farnham in Hampshire in England. So that's how they are here. However, TÜV SÜD are not yet designated by the MHRA to be a UK approved body. They're going through the process of being allowed to be one. So again, the UK approved body can only be a company that's based in the UK, even if it's a foreign company, the UK office. And that's where SGS comes in. It's an Anglo-Belgian company. And they have, again, many years had an office in the UK. They got designated as a UK earlier. There's one other company, German one, Decra, which has recently got they're gone through their process with the MHRA to be designated as a UK approved body, and that's it. And the other thing I should add on that subject, for anyone who's got hardware stuff in the past, please remember that UK approved bodies and EU notified bodies are coded for competencies. So the type of products they're allowed to certify. So out of, say, however many, 80 or something notified bodies, last time I looked, there's something like 29 that are allowed to do software, SAMD products. And out of all the notified bodies, there are only a handful, 5 or 6, who could actually do IVDs. So it's not just about having a notified body, it's about one that is allowed to certify the type of product that you wish to put to market. Oh, great. So Karen Deep has already, Erica, given you the list to the MCAB, the UK database. You said for labeling, check out 82304-2. Well, that's, yeah, that's a little aside. 82304-2 provides a labeling, an idea like you have on fridges and cars, you know, that how energy efficient things they are. That standard is IC 82304-2 is proposing a similar sort of thing about how good health software is and how well its clinical basis behind it has been made, how secure it is, how usable it is. Not quite the same thing as the statutory label. Right, Brian, to everyone, is there an unwritten rule about how much percentage you have for automatic testing? That's an interesting one. You need to create some formal requirements, formal software requirements. And what the standard says is every requirement must be verified. So you create requirements at the sort of a gray box and black box level of your software. If you're talking completely white box and unit testing, another requirement that's in the standard 62304 says the manufacturer must create acceptance criteria for all software units and must keep records of the criteria being met. So what do we propose normally as the most pragmatic thing to do? What software unit acceptance criteria? Which pieces of code do you want another member of your team or the team leader to review, to do peer review or a ritual formalized technical review of the software? Next bit of software unit acceptance criteria. What rules do you set for yourself? And again, this is where you have to customize your own product, that some particular software may need to have unit tests, automated unit tests, and some pieces don't. You need to set rules and stick to them for each project. Third rule, what do you do for style enforcement? Which means particular coding techniques, what coding standards do your developers apply, which is linked to the peer review. So what do you expect them to apply and what will you find in peer review? For the more critical things. And the other part of style enforcement is how do you just enforce the visual style, where are your tabs versus spaces? How do you do indenting? How do you comment? So those are all unit acceptance criteria. And I as mentioned, the record of them is perhaps as simple as only doing your pull request in Git or, committing to your version control with a structured comment that says we have done all of these things that our software development plan, the process plan that specifies the unit acceptance criteria, say we've done. That makes sense. Please put something more in the chat if that doesn't. I'm just reading the next long question about UDI implementation, blah, blah, blah. In particular, with Class 2A SAMD, the manufacturer will apply UDI, DI, and PI right. Sometimes difficult to find a process to update UDI, PI after patch release. Do you have in mind where? Yes, we do. My favored way is use Semver 2.0.0, the semantic versioning, it's an open source standard for how to create version numbers, how to consistently use your sort of xx.yy.zz, your major.minor.patch release numbering. That's part of it. So once you use Semver in a consistent fashion across your project, because everyone uses that sort of versioning differently. It's very amusing, really, until you actually standardize. You say to people, when we're helping them write the software development plan. So how do you decide when it's major, minor, or patch? And everyone makes it up unless they're using a standard. So we propose a particular way to use Semver if we're starting from scratch with a client. And then the next thing is that very easily leads to you decide in the UDI-DI how to, and the UDI-PI, how to represent the version number. It's up to the manufacturer, and then I'll show you in a minute. So as currently talking, I'll just be able to bring it up for after that. A potential way for it to appear in the label, if that helps. Right, Radka must a European-based legal manufacturer appoint a UK-based distributor and importer if they want to place assembly on the UK market. I'm aware that the MHRA only accepts registration of devices from UK responsible person that is based in the UK. Right, Radka, there are 4 different concepts there: manufacturer, UK responsible person, distributor, and importer. Let me preface this that I can't find MHRA guidance that's definitive for software. I've asked the MHRA and they can't answer. They haven't thought about that, perhaps, or they haven't got to a stage where they could publish guidance properly. So it is very tricky. It's perhaps easier if you've got an app on Apple App Store and Google Play, because as talked about earlier, as Hugh mentioned earlier, they're already your distributor. The App Store is your distributor. So you've appointed one by having an App Store entry. Importer is a real grey area. Under EU MDR, it's much stricter, and we've got to see where that goes with the UK MDR. The UK MDR, based on the old MDD, as Karen Deep was saying to you, doesn't really so strictly define the role of the importer. So you get away with it at the moment. But yeah, I can't answer because I can't find something sensible in writing from the MHRA to answer. Just know what the EU MDR says, and the MHRA at the moment are being not definitive about what it means in the UK. All we know is you do need this concept of UK responsible person, which is a different thing again. It's not necessarily your importer or distributor. That's the MHRA's interface in case they need to contact a manufacturer abroad. So what else is there? So Andrew, there's a self-reference to sound in continuous integration, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, or continuous delivery. It's not mentioned in 62304. It is just 62304 says you need to make up some sort of process, whatever it is. Do you want to answer the next ones, Karen? What point shall the company aim to get their certificates?
Yeah, so I've responded to that. I mean, the earlier the better, really. You start developing your systems for 2 reasons. If you start working towards a certificate in the first place, you could do it right the first time, rather than doing something and then realize maybe you've been doing it wrong and not following a process. Number 2, of course, there is time when it comes to these certificates. So, for example, if you wanted to go for ISO 13485, the notified or approved bodies, or even a certification body, is going to make you wait anywhere from 3 to 6 months. So the earlier you begin that process, the better off you are, rather than apply and then try to do it in retrospect. So on the topic of that, then, quality management system. So first, what is a quality management system? It's basically a structured system of procedures and processes. Now, what does it cover? In short, it covers design. So what are your design changes? Every time you make a change to your software medical device, or even if you have a physical medical device, what are the changes around it? Manufacturing, what are your manufacturing facilities like? Is it sterile? Is it non-sterile? Do you have a manufacturing facility? Are you going to be outsourcing it? Of course, supply chain is also part of that as well. Risk management, what I talked about earlier, ISO 14971. Management responsibility, are top management involved? Are they given the adequate resources? Are the adequate training taking place? Customer related processes, so how does a customer go about buying from you? How do you deal in terms of feedback or complaints? And then, of course, CAPAs, which are corrective actions and preventive actions. Now, people often get the CAPA process confused. Now, CAPA stands for corrective action and preventive action. Corrective action is what you do after the problem's happened. Preventive action is what you do before the problem even occurs. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier with post-market surveillance is go out and find modes of failure of similar products out on the market. And then you can have a preventive action in place to stop even something like that even happening to your device. That's the difference between the two, corrective and preventive. Now, of course, plenty of preventive actions are great. It means that you're taking action. If you have a lot of corrective actions, then maybe you need to look into your processes and think, okay, why does this device keep failing, or why do we keep having these corrective actions? So effectively, what is the purpose of a QMS? Number one is, of course, optimal end product. And number two, the most important thing with any medical device, minimize risk for end users. The last thing we want to do is go out and harm people. The whole purpose of a medical device is benefiting people. We really don't want to go there and harm people effectively. So that's basically what we want to do. So the topic that I was talking on earlier is standards and regulations. They're two different things. Now, standards are formally recognized way, i.e. best practices, however, are voluntary, though highly recommended. Whilst regulations are law, therefore mandatory. So the international standard for ISO 13485, for quality management systems is ISO 13485 2016. And under the EU MDR, Article 10.9, that is a regulatory requirement for quality management systems. Now, EU MDR Article 10.9 is mostly covered by ISO 13485. So if you have an ISO 13485 compliant system, you've ticked nearly every box apart from registration, reporting, things like UDI, strategy for regulatory compliance, etc. But if you have an ISO 13485 system, there isn't a lot much more work to get it to EU MDR effectively. Now, what I was talking about earlier, you may be looking at standards and you might see the prefixes BSEN and EN, or you might just see ISO. So what does this mean? Now, ISO is an international standard, so it's internationally recognized. So if you see ISO 13485, that's internationally recognized. Now, the EN version is the version that's aligned with the EU regulations. So if you go to the EN version of ISO 13485, you'll see what's known as Z annexes, which will have the clauses of 13485 and the relevant parts of the regulation, and it shows how it aligns. And then, of course, the BSEN in standards is the version that aligns with the UK regulations. So effectively, if you are targeting the Great Britain market, you want to follow the BSEN version of standards. If you're targeting the EU market, you want to follow the EN versions of standards. And if you're targeting any jurisdiction out of that, the ISO standard is fine. But again, like I said, it's just the difference of Z annexes. It's not massively different. But if you are targeting those jurisdictions, please make sure that you've got the right standards in place and make sure that you're referencing them too. Next slide, Mike.
Yeah, so we're also going to the next slide just to say for the software audience and the audience, those standards are basically identical for most of software. It's where it's hardware devices, they tend to have regional variations. So having said all of that, don't be too scared of it. They're basically all identical to each other for software.
Yep. So this is an interesting one. And people often say, what does the certification process look like? So first of all, of course, is the preparation phase. You're bringing in a quality management system, whether that's an EQMS or a paper-based system. You work with your team, you put the adequate resources in place. Maybe you have some sort of project management and you build a quality management system. Now, a lot of companies make the mistake, they go straight for a stage 1 audit without doing an internal audit. The first thing you guys want to do is have a mock audit internally for 2 reasons. Number 1, you want to make sure that your QMS is up to scratch. And then, of course, number 2, you want to make sure that your staff are able to handle an audit situation. Can they handle the pressure? Can they handle the questions that are going to be thrown at them? Do they know what their scope is in terms of what the job responsibilities are, what there isn't? So, for example, if you have a job role and an auditor asks you a question about a different job role, there's absolutely nothing wrong saying to the auditor, say, that's out of my scope, speak to XYZ person. So it's about getting your staff ready for these sort of things. Now, an ISO 13485 audit is broken down into 2 different stages, stage 1 and stage 2. So stage 1 is basically, sorry, I should have mentioned, so the people that are going to audit you are either going to be a notified body, an approved body, or a certification body. Notified and approved bodies are bodies that either give you CE marking or UKCA respectively. A certification body only can grant you an ISO certificate, but can't do your CE or UKCA. But each one of those 3 effectively can give you. So ideally, if you're a medical device and you want to have a CE mark or a UKCA mark, ideally, you want to go for a notified body. The last thing you want is to have 1 certification body and then a notified body, because you're effectively paying twice for the same thing, more or less.
Certification bodies, sorry, Karen, so just to say that certification bodies are effectively useless for software products. They're only really for people who make like widgets, things to go into other devices. So the manufacturers of a a stainless steel screw that has got some medical device purpose on it might need a 13485. The manufacturer of tubing to go into some sort of blood device, you know, blood bag or something, or dialysis systems, which is something I used to work on, could have a certification authority 13485. That you've really got to have a UK approved body or a EU notified body 13485 certification if you want to actually be a manufacturer of the final device, including the final SAMD.
Yep,
Okay.
completely agree with what Mike is saying. If you are seeking a UK CA or CE mark, it's a waste of time getting a certification body. Like Mike was saying, the only time you perhaps people who want certification bodies are people like, you know, component manufacturers and maybe don't want a UK CA mark or a CE mark, but make components that may go into a medical device. In that case, it makes sense for them to get a certification body. So your stage 1 audit effectively it's more of an adequacy check. Do these guys have a quality management system in place? Do they have the right resources? Do they have the right people? And, you know, is this going to work? So they're not necessarily looking at your records. They're more looking at your procedures and your resources. And then you have non-conformities known as minors and majors, basically. And then, of course, between a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit, now this process can be anywhere from about 8 to 12 weeks. That's what we generally see. There's going to be amendments because there's going to be findings, and not even findings, and auditors sometimes might have a suggestion for improvement. So they may look at something that you're doing, and you may not necessarily be doing it wrong, but they may say to you, hey, you know, why don't you try it this way, or maybe do something else. So then you have your amendments. Now your stage 2 audit is your final official audit. Now at this point, they're going to be looking more at your records. So if your procedure says we're going to be doing X, Y, Z, they're going to be looking at your records to make sure that you're actually doing those things. So that's the difference between a stage 1 and a stage 2. And then in a stage 2, again, you're going to have minor nonconformities and major nonconformities. A minor nonconformity is exactly that. It's minor. And it means you're going to pass. And what they do is when you have your next annual audit, so these audits happen annually, they're going to be looking into your minor nonconformity and see how you dealt with it. Now, if you have a major nonconformity, what they often do is they send you what's known as a template for a corrective action plan. So then you have to discuss with the notified body via this plan what action you're going to take to fix that. And usually with notified bodies, they want that within the next 60 to 90 days. They then accept that. And then basically you have your ISO 13485 certificate, and then you have an annual audit. And then every third year, you can have what's known as a recertification audit effectively. So that's how it works with ISO 13485. Next slide, please, Mike. So case study 1, this is one that we often see here at Hardian Health. So company X, what's the first thing you do when you don't know anything? You go into Google and you say, you know, how do I do X, Y, Z? Or you go into YouTube, whatever. So what a lot of companies are doing, they're just going online and type in, what is a quality management system or what is it? And you're going to see all of these adverts, and I'm not knocking any quality management system out there. What companies are doing is they're just going out and they're buying an EQMS, which comes with templates, which are absolutely fine. And then the templates will say, insert company name here. They put the company name in there and they fire away and they just start using them as is. Now, the smarter companies still buy these EQMS systems. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, either what they do is they bring on consultants like here at Hardian, or they have more experienced staff come in and they tailor the procedures accordingly. Because a quality management system is not a one size fits all. There's a lot of dependence. Are you a company with 100 employees? Are you a company with 5 employees? There's a big difference how you're going to go about doing things. Number 2, what kind of products are you making? So there's a lot of software medical devices out there, but a lot of these software medical devices may not be software exclusively. They may also have a physical element. So for example, let's just say something to do, it's a software that maybe detects COPD. You may have a breathing apparatus, or maybe it's ECG related. So you may have something on your phone that shows data, and then you have some sort of ECG detectors, etc., that you place onto your heart, anything like that, really. That's the difference. So then you need to tailor that accordingly. So this is a case study. Now, both companies have their audits during the same time period. Can you guess what happens between company X and company Y? Company X will have multiple major and minor nonconformities, because what's happened is they've got a separate set of templates that follows EU MDR Article 10.9 and ISO 13485, which is perfectly fine. So they've met the requirements, but it doesn't meet the requirements of what that company actually does internally. Company Y, on the other hand, has tailored it and actually built a system that actually works for them. They just pass with a few minor nonconformities. So what exactly happens here? Online EQMS systems or templates are exactly that. They're basically just the bare bones. They're just templates. They need to be tailored to the specifics of your company and products, or they will not be effective. Because the issue here is, two different parts. Number one is, of course, making things compliant. And number two is also the human element of it. If I write most of you here today on this call a procedure and say, this is how you must do something, some of you on this call may not even understand what I'm doing. What the smart companies are doing is they're speaking to their staff and say, how would you go about doing this? That staff member then writes down how you go about doing it. And then the QA professional that basically sits down and says, okay, this is what we need to do to make it compliant. So you need to write things that make sense to your staff and work in such a way that they understand. So always remember, a quality management system can't be bought, it can only be built. That's a very important factor here. So by all means, go out and buy EQMS systems, but always understand there's no such thing really as a turnkey EQMS system. It always requires some form of modification. Next slide, please, Mike. So EU MDR and UK MDR 2002. So effectively, like I touched on earlier, EU MDR came out on the 26th of May, 2021. It was initially supposed to come out on the 26th of May, 2020. Now, COVID and various different things like notified body availability delayed that deadline. And then, of course, we have the UK MDR, which is basically just the old EU MDD. So the old EU MDD was adopted by the UK pre-Brexit. And then post-Brexit, we had the EU MDR. So the UK stuck to the old version. So that's basically the differences here. So like I was touching, a notified body, EU, approved body, UK. That's the difference between them. They are independent certification bodies. Now, it's very important here to understand. So hands up, anybody here who has a software medical device that they're looking to bring onto the market within the next year or two. Let's have a show of hands. All reactions, since I can't see your cameras. Okay, so I'm seeing some hands coming up. What you guys need to understand is that there's a big backlog when it comes to EU notified bodies. So from what we talk to and what we see from notified bodies, we are currently seeing 12 to 24 months prior to them being able to begin the technical file review process. Forget about even receiving your CE mark. That's just beginning the process. And even then, to make that worse is at the moment, there's currently 37 EU notified bodies from when I last checked on the NANDO database. Only a fraction of them actually have scope for software. So not every notified body can certify every single medical device. But then even that, to make that worse, software devices are relatively new. They haven't been around for years and years. If you go to a notified body, often what they have is what's known as a technical expert. So things like cardiology, stents, pacemakers, etc. There's tons of people out there that have worked with these devices and the technical expertise. But when you take it down to software, there's only a few select people that can actually do that. So the issue with the notified bodies is, number one, less scope. Number two, they don't necessarily have the in-house expertise to deal with that. So if any of you guys here on this call are thinking of having a software medical device onto the market within the next year or two, start these conversations right now with the notified bodies. Like I said, if you're going to have to wait 12 to 24 months, start this conversation now. Don't make the mistake of building a technical files and then having to wait for a year or two effectively. That's the last thing that you want to do. Now, in terms of risk classifications, we have class 1, class 2A, class 2B, and class 3. Now, I've not put software here, and I've done that on purpose because you can quite clearly see what the differences here are with medical device risk classification. So under Rule 11 EU MDR, nearly every software device that you come across can be minimum class 2A. So you're going to be paired up against things like dental filings, surgical clamps, tubes, etc. Now, if your software device is going to be used for more than 30 days, of course, you're going to be a class 2B. So you're basically looking up against lung ventilators, bone fixation plates, etc. And then in some circumstances, depending on your claims, intended use, and what you do with the software, you might even be up there with pacemakers, things like stents in the very, very high-risk devices. So it's very important to do that. Now, class 1 devices can be self-certified without the need for a notified body. Now, there is an exception to that, apart from those that are sterile, reusable, or have a measuring function. Now, if you're any one of those three, you won't necessarily have a full technical file review, but the notified and or approved bodies will want to be looking at whatever is the sterile element, reusable element, or the measuring function in terms of your technical files. Now, class 1 devices still need full technical files. You're just not going to be audited against them. But don't be fooled into this. Me and Mike have come across situations where class 1 medical devices, manufacturers have been contacted by the MHRA due to claims that they've made. And the MHRA is simply trying to say, take your product off the market. So don't think just because you're a class 1 that you get away with things, you're not being monitored. The MHRA are very hot on this at the moment, so be warned. Next slide, please, Mike. So this is a very, very important one that you guys need to understand. We have Great Britain, we have the United Kingdom, and then, of course, the British Isles, and then we have Ireland. UKCA is applied to England, Wales, and Scotland, Great Britain, GB. Very important that you understand that. Now, due to the situation in Ireland, we have Northern Ireland and we have Ireland, but we have a soft border. So effectively, if you have something in Northern Ireland, you can factually drive down to Ireland and probably no one's even going to stop you. So then that's what we have. Now, we have this very weird conformity assessment called the UKNI, which I personally think is kind of pointless. The UKNI effectively follows the EU MDR. So if you're going to go and follow the EU MDR, you're better off just getting a CE marking that just to get a UKNI. So UKNI is basically a UKCA plus allows you to sell in Northern Ireland. But if you're going to go for the effort of putting EU MDR in place, you're better off just getting the CE marking. But it's very important that you understand the difference between these terms, between Great Britain, UK, and Ireland, effectively. Post-Brexit, it's important that you understand the differences. Yep, go ahead, Mike. Next slide. So, oh, too fast. One before, please. There we are. So what were the main changes under the EU MDR on the 26th of May, 2021? Now, of course, the definition of a medical device slightly changed. That wasn't a huge difference, but there were some differences, as Mike touched on to earlier. Risk classifications. Now, the MDR had certain parts in there where, by definition, certain medical devices were being up-classified, especially with software devices under Rule 11. There's more strict on post-market surveillance and periodic safety update reports. Also for distributors and importers. Now, for those of you who are just software medical device companies, fine, it doesn't really affect you. But for those of you dealing with physical products, there's a bit more onus on importers and distributors. Now, even pharmacies can be considered to be distributors effectively, and then there's certain obligations that they have to have, which is things like make sure that your label is in order, make sure that your UDI is in order, and there's a lot more obligation on them. And then, of course, we have UDI, Unique Device Identification, which we're going to touch on to later on. And then, of course, the UDIMED database, which is going to be a big database. It's not really fully up and running at the moment, but it's going to be a full database of where you get to see what the manufacturer is, what their products are, and what complaints effectively they had against them. So quite a few changes under the EU MDR, which in my opinion were welcome. To really need them because they're all safety driven. So next slide, please, Mike. The one before. One before, Mike. Yep, there we are. So the EU MDR, like I said, it came into force 26th of May, 2021. Now, specific to software, if you have a look at this box here, rule number 11. Software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnostic or therapeutic processes is classified as a Class 2A. So effectively, nearly every software medical device is more or less doing this. So by definition, has automatically gone to a Class 2A, which under the old EU MDD or UK MDR were effectively Class 1 devices. So a lot of software devices are previously Class 1, therefore didn't require a full quality management system. And that's a very important thing that you understand. So under the old EU MDD, if you were a Class 1 software, you didn't actually require a full quality management system. All you needed was post-market surveillance, CAPA, product registration, and adverse event reporting. You didn't need the full works, and now you actually do. And like I mentioned earlier, the UK MDR is basically a carbon copy of the EU MDD. So it's very important here that a lot of companies understand this. The reality is that there is very, very little Class 1 software as a medical device under EU MDR, because the moment you're doing something with it or making any claims, you effectively fall under Rule 11. So, yep, go ahead, Mike. Yep, next slide, please, Mike. So, Habib, I've just seen your question. Is post-market surveillance and clinical follow-up followed by the companies themselves? Yes, it is. What's happened here is effectively you are responsible for post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. So it does come at a cost to the company, is something to factor in. Radka, can you please provide an example that is not intended to provide information used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes? So that would be qualifying as Class 1. Mike, I think you had a couple of examples this didn't you? Mike?
So yeah, this is the bit that's funny question about what can be a Class 1 device and what you could do under the MDD, so under the UK MDR currently. So the obvious one here is going back to a question from earlier: mental health apps that deliver CBT under the old EU MDD and under the current UK MDR are Class 1, because the way that the MDD is written, apps that they don't provide information used to take decisions, diagnostic or therapeutic purposes. So that's why they're class 1 currently. However, under the MDR, they will be class 2. There'll be class 2A or class 2B, and actually you could even get a mental health app being class 3. And why could a mental health app be class 3? It's because if you are, and again, this is about intended use and patient population, if you're in the patient population who has a PHQ-9 positive question for suicidal ideation, could something that the app suggests to them to do cause them actually to go and attempt to take their own life? That's a reality of the situation. And that's why the EU MDR potentially can treat some mental health apps as class 3. Is there anything else? So I was just trying to move back, Karen, deep to your slide, because you mentioned earlier, just put back on the screen, where was it? This classification. So that's the MDR classification. So then that's then sort of superseded by what we showed the matrix earlier, where you say if you diagnose or treat, that comes into it. So does that help at all, Radka? I'll move on once you're typing. Karen, where was your next one?
Yep, that's your bit then, isn't it, Mike? Intended use.
All right. So these questions are great, by the way, audience. These segues really are working, because let's now get on to the formality of intended use and how software development fits in with clinical development. Intended use statement is, when we do it, it's something like a 10-page document that starts with, what's your intended medical indication? So what specifically are you going to do? And Karen, you have some examples in a moment. Intended patient population. Who actually are your patients? And just from that example I just gave, your intended patient population could be someone on a certain range on a PHQ-9 or GAD instrument. They could be, as I said earlier, with the optical dermatoscopy for skin cancer detection, have to be in a certain range on the Fitzpatrick scale, so how dark is their skin? Things like this. Needs to be specific. Who are your intended user groups? Primary and secondary. So who is going to put information into your system? Because there could be a thing about their training and things that could cause an error for the information. And, you know, the software garbage in, garbage out. And then who reads the output? Karen Deep said it earlier. Are they specialists? Are they generalists, or what? What's their level of experience and training to be able to interact with what you put to them? What sort of technical jargon or clinical jargon you use? Intended environment. Really, for software, we're talking about, is it for use in a clinical setting, like in a consulting room? Is it for use in a home setting? And then we talk about technical environment as well. Is it something that's cloud served? Is it something that's on premise for software? Because that's important to know, perhaps more about cybersecurity and responsiveness than patient safety, unless, you know, patient safety derives from the responsiveness of the software. Or if a denial of service of the software, so the internet breaks and you're relying on that software, will that compromise patient safety? And what's your mitigation against it? Operating principle, again, we talk about the clinical principle and the technical principle. Clinical operating principle, it boils down to, if you're detecting or diagnosing something, 3 key things that can go wrong. What happens if you have false positive, because you haven't got 100% accuracy? So false positive, will you say someone has got some condition, you think someone's got some condition, you'll send them off for, say, an unnecessary biopsy, an unnecessary surgical procedure, which has its own risks of infection and what have you. Perhaps worse sometimes is, what happens if you have a false negative? You say someone hasn't got a condition that they have. Will it temporarily or permanently worsen because you've relied on the software to detect it or diagnose it? And the third one is denial of service. what happens if your software is not available. The internet's broken, the physical server is broken, something is broken and you can't use it. Is there a fallback, or has your clinician become so utterly dependent on that software that it's a critical part of their care pathway? That's what we consider under clinical operating principle and technical operating principle. So we talk about SAMD, so we often talk about AI or other techniques. Number one, how far are you stretching the term AI? Are you using decision trees, directed acyclic graphs, to traverse a set of inputs that deterministically get a set of outputs? Are you using deep convoluted neural networks? Are you doing some stochastic thing with statistics of a population to predict something for a patient? What are you doing? We like to know all of this, because then it leads into the clinical evaluation pathway. And I missed one. And then what is the foreseeable misuse? What can you say to begin with that could be a patient safety factor? What can be a user safety factor? So for a SAMD on its own, potentially there isn't user safety, you're just talking about patient safety. But when we think about things like the thermometer and all, earlier, let me make a contrived example. If you insert the thermometer, could you get an infection? Could you get an injury from the patient? Something that's user safety. And the third one is cybersecurity. We consider leak of patient data, leak of confidential data, to be a harm to the patient. So harm is not just physical, it's also about their data. So foreseeable misuse comes into what the first things you can say, and even down to, if your patient in your app, you have a click through end user license agreement, or terms and conditions says, we are using the data in this app to calculate this answer and give you, does it also say, if you want to use the data for research, you want to use the data for some other monetization, are they giving the consent for your for data to be used like that? Foreseeable misuse of software as a medical device covers those headings in the way we see it. So this comes on to clinical evaluation planning, which is the flow chart on the right is saying about, actually for software particularly, you work in lockstep. Clinical evaluation planning says then you make a plan. What is your narrative for saying you've come from a clinically good idea to proving that it's safe and effective? So what are the steps on the right? Very quickly, you create a plan that says you do the first step we call valid clinical association or scientific validity of your solution. We start with literature review. What does the scientific literature and what does the regulatory literature? So the regulatory databases, general, a bit of structured Googling, but very systematic scientific literature review. And we do ours based on PRISMA guidelines for how to perform the review in a systematic, structured way. What does the existing peer-reviewed robust literature say about why is what you're doing valid? So say you're trying to find a biomarker for things we do, and it's in the public domain, we do with clients, biomarker for particular epilepsy conditions and the background signal of an EEG. What scientific literature says you could conceivably do that? Say you're doing arrhythmia detection in ECG heart tracers. What scientific literature says you can detect something that it's well known what the waveform looks like when there's something going wrong with a person's heart rhythm? So valid clinical association is hopefully mostly done about the concept is proven, or you might do some experimentation. Going to a previous question of somebody's, do you need to do some experimentation to prove that your hypothesis that there is a biomarker available in something you want to detect and use to inform or drive clinical management is really available? From that, you derive requirements, which then say this is the performance, the accuracy you need, or something like this, in however you need to measure it. Some of it is regulatory. So say you go to the FDA, they have particular requirements about how you measure accuracy of radiology products, for instance. You figure out what are your product requirements from that, and then you engineer the release candidate for your software as a medical device. Because where that overlaps clinical development is then the analytical validity. If you like, what's the efficacy now of your software? How good can it be? How accurate can it be under ideal conditions? So that we call that software verification. If you remember, Karandeep made a distinction with his jacket example earlier about verification and validation. So once you say how good can the software be, then you start saying in the hands of real clinical users, so the intended users that we mentioned in the intended use statement on the left, how safe, how effective, and how cyber secure is it really? So we go from efficacy, how good could it be, to how good is it really behaving in the hands of real world use. And that's the point at which you write your clinical evaluation report to say that actually we are safe, effective, and cyber secure to go on the market. Like there's some formality about that in the UK and the EU about this. So in the EU, we have what we call the general safety and performance requirements. There's a list of requirements in Annex 1 of the medical device regulation that says, before you're allowed on the market, all the relevant ones of these must be satisfied. So what the clinical evaluation report is saying from a clinical viewpoint, which general safety and performance requirements, how have they been satisfied? And we are safe, effective, and secure enough to go on the market. And then we get into the periodic, the post-market surveillance, periodic safety update reporting that Karandeep said earlier. So that was a very quick introduction to say, and I think I've said it, so I'll say it again. We find, particularly with software as a medical device, you really need to consider holistically the software development lifecycle with this clinical development lifecycle to understand at which points in this lifecycle do particular results that you rely on to demonstrate safety, effectiveness, cybersecurity of your product will pop out. And what do you need to then prove potentially post-market? What do you need to add? And therefore, how much do you have to limit your product claims to get on the market in the first place versus what can you experiment with once you're on the market to be able to expand your claims? So I hope that I spoke very quickly. Hope that makes some sort of sense. And Karandeep, what's next?
Yeah. Do you want to do this, Mike, or you want me to do it?
Yeah, you do it, because my throat.
Okay, perfect.
Yelling
No
about that passionate subject, my throat needs something.
Right, so the intended use statement. So we're going to give you some examples of what is a clear, well-written intended use statement versus one that may cause issues. So ideally, what we're trying to say here is don't be ambiguous. Try and be very clear about what your device actually is, because when you're clear what your device is, then you can work accordingly. I know that me and Mike keep banging on about the intended use statement, but it is important that this is basically the spine of your medical device. It holds everything together. So if you get this right, everything else will be much easier effectively. So for the next few slides, you're going to see examples in red, which are a poor example and may be ambiguous. And then blue is going to be a good example. So this is the next slide. So intended medical indication in red. The ECG analysis platform provides its ECG signal processing and analysis through any of the off-shelf suitable ECG electronic devices. Versus ECG data is obtained from an implantable cardiac device. So it says where is it actually being obtained from. Smartwatches or any other over-the-counter data obtained from consumer-grade electronics are not suitable for analysis with the product. So there's a select few. This is not saying that anything off the shelf works with it. There's a select few that is going to be working with it. And then it clearly states that the platform provides an ECG signal processing and analysis with the following outputs. So for example, I've not put the outputs there because it's going to take up the whole slide, but you can see this is very clear. Where is the data coming from? How is the data being obtained? And what exactly are the outputs? The one in red doesn't clearly state that. It's a very loose term, effectively. So this is very important that we're very clear with these things. Next one, please, Mike.
Yeah, if I may, Karandeep, the pervading theme of this is, if you claim it, you have to prove it. So basically, this one is just saying, if you claim you can do anything with any input, how are you going to prove it? Or is there a more constrained product? So this goes straight back into, again, holistically, health economics and everything else that was mentioned earlier about your product strategy. What's the low-hanging fruit for your product? What can you get on the market and monetize? Because that's probably most people's aim. And then extend your claims. So even things like, if we are working with, as we often do in radiology settings, is your product only going to work on a Siemens CT machine, or will it work on a GE one, or will it work on a Fujitsu one? Because they all impart characteristics to the input signal, to the images, to your product. So how widely do you need to prove your work And what's the list of compatibility you have, because that's actually a general safety and performance requirement as well. If you have a software product that connects to other systems, what's the compatibility? Which is the hint to say, in this context, which scanners, or in this, if you've got like implantable cardiac devices, which make and model have you tried it with? These things. Let me move on. Karen, please.
Sure. So intended patient population. So the target of product will be all adults apart from those with existing heart conditions. What is an adult? It's very important that, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, the definition of adult can vary from across the world. Some people may class adults as 16 years old, some may class adults as 18-year-olds, some maybe 21-year-olds. So it's very important that we put that there. So
the other thing as well with that, sorry, Karen, but just interfered. If it's a business to consumer, like an app, the other thing you've got to consider, as was mentioned many slides ago, data protection law. Actually, if you say something is for children and it's an app, for instance, actually children can only sign up for their own data under the EU and UK GDPR from the age of 13 for their own data to be used. So actually, is there a thing about parental consent as well? Just on the side of all this medical stuff, let alone, some things you want to discover in pediatrics, and so the clinicians here can say it better than I can. Actually, things look different in pediatrics. The way, whilst body structures are still growing and developing, they don't behave the same as adult developed ones. So I think this is where we're coming from, Karen D.
Yep. So that's a very important one that Mike puts in there. For example, if it is the case that parental consent is needed, you need to put that there, children from the age of, let's say, 10 plus, and in the case of the child is less than 13 years old or 16 years old, whatever limit you put, that there is parental consent in there. It's important that's put there. Because why that's important is because if parental consent is needed, you need to make sure that it's in your instructions for use that's clearly stated. So effectively, that's what we go back to. This is the backbone of your medical device, because this tells you what effectively you need to put in your documentation. So also we put here that there's no upper limit. That's very important to put down for the assessment of arrhythmias. Now, if this is a gender-specific condition, we also need to mention the gender too, if that is the case with your products. And then as we can see here, it's not just for the assessment of heart conditions, it's just the assessment of arrhythmias. And we quite clearly stated that effectively who these people basically are. So super clear in terms of what that is, what the age group is, because just using the term adult, depending on where you go across the world, can be interpreted differently. Next one, please, Mike. So I think we skipped one. There we are. So intended parts of the body or types of tissue applied or interacted with hearts. That's probably a really bad example. And then versus product is a software as a medical device, therefore not applicable. In this case, it's a software medical device. It's not actually going at any part of the body or any types of tissues. So what you do in this case, you basically make that clear that it's not applicable. And then, of course, anything that's part of your GSPR, EU MDR technical documentation in regards to things touching the body, i.e. biocompatibility, automatically you can just tick those things off as not applicable. So it just makes that very clear from the get-go what kind of things you need to be doing. Next one, please. So intended user profile, it's intended for use by all healthcare professionals. Now, it's important to understand here that healthcare professionals have very differing jobs and also qualifications. You may have a cardiologist out there with 20 plus years experience that understands this device from the get-go. However, there may be somebody who's just a nurse that's come out of university and perhaps doesn't understand these things. So it needs to be very clear. And you can see that I've put it here, qualified healthcare professionals. So if your medical device requires specific training, you might need to put that through. Or if you have a device that requires some sort of technical knowledge, you need to make sure what these qualifications are. So you make that very clear. Who are the healthcare professionals? So general practitioners, cardiologists, doctors, cardiologists, trained technicians in ECG interpretation, and trained nurses in ECG interpretation. So not just any nurse can do this, but somebody who is trained in ECG. So we made that very clear from the get-go. And again, this goes back to the instructions for you. So we've clearly identified who is the audience and what training needs to be done. Yep, next one, please, Mike. So use environment. Product has been used to provide a diagnosis for the assessment of arrhythmias using ECG data. Okay, very ambiguous. Now, versus the product has been designed to support physicians and qualified healthcare professionals. That's very important. I should have put that in bold, the word support. At this moment in time, software medical devices are support tools. They assist with your decision, but they are not making the decision for you. It's still the physician and the qualified healthcare professional that makes that decision-making process, as is clear by the second bit effectively. So these are assistance tools. They are not basically taking the job away from the physician. They're basically making the physician's life easier and allowing them to process more data than they usually do. So super clear on this one. Yep, next one, Mike.
So sorry, I was on the page to get the privilege of interjecting something. Just a thought process for all those you involved in AI and say decision support algorithms. There are three buckets you could perhaps put them in: assistive, augmentative, and autonomous. So are they assisting a clinician to make a decision in some way, or are they augmenting the clinician? There's a subtle difference between the two, that the clinician's already got some information and the tool is adding to it. But perhaps the icing on the cake that hasn't been baked yet by pretty much any manufacturer, are they really truly autonomous AI? Can they diagnose on their own? And again, this is where you have to be so careful with your claims and understanding really where your product is going currently and where you want it to go in the future. Goes back to the intended use, goes back to regulatory strategy. What can you do in a reasonable time and cost? Because hey, these are commercial things, reasonable time and cost and return on investment. What can you do versus what would you ideally want to do with that technology? I've gone too far again.
No, that was it, Mike. Use
Right.
environment. I think that blank was for you to answer questions.
Yeah, this was now an opportunity. Perhaps we won't have another real break now, because we only got 30 minutes of the slot left. But perhaps we'll wait a moment for people to put questions. And whilst we're doing that, I said I'd switch over to just showing you a couple of labels. Maybe I'll do that for a moment. Let me show you. Oh, where's my Zoom gone? Here is a medical device label for an app that the whole of the UK population got a bit too familiar with for a few years. The ISO 15223-1 symbols down the left. Ref means for software, what's the version? There's little unfilled in factory looking thing. Talks about when you manufacture, the filled in factory is the name and address of the manufacturer. The feedback information is is how you can actually contact, say that in this case, the UK HSA. Karen Deep, whilst I'm putting the next one on the screen, the favourite anecdote about the validation of complaint and feedback systems, perhaps.
Oh yeah, that's a very interesting one. So software validation is very important. Now, if you're a software medical device, of course, you validate what your device does. However, as part of your quality management system, if you're going to be using things like forms, workflows, etc., and they feed into your quality management system, i.e. a complaints portal or a feedback portal, it needs to be validated. And a really good example that me and Mike have is one time we went up to one of our clients that we're building a QMS for, and we said to them, hey guys, how exactly do you receive feedback or complaints? And they said, well, if you go onto our website, there are 2 contact us forms. And if somebody contacts us, they come through. Okay, have you guys had any complaints recently? They said no. Between that call, me and Mike decided to submit a fake complaint to them to see what happens. We jumped onto the call with them the following week and said, hey guys, have you had any complaints? They said no. We turned around and said, what about the one that we just put in? Then we realized that the system was broken. And that is the importance of validation, because the last thing you want happening is if a complaint or feedback comes to you and it's negative, the next thing they're going to be doing is reporting it to the MHRA or perhaps your notified body, and then you've got a bigger problem on your hands. Or worst case scenario, if they spot something wrong with your device and they've told you about it and you haven't realized that, your device potentially may go out and cause harm or injury to your end users. So this is why it's very important to validate your systems. Are they doing the job that they need to do and delivering consistently?
And there's a funny one, corollary to that these days, what we also often advise and put into our QMS training for our clients is everyone in your company should be aware on their socials that anything that they monitor, either through work or through their socials for their own leisure purposes, if it says something about the product of your company, is it a feedback or is it a complaint? that you should actually pay attention to, that they should report into the company, let alone if you've got like a social media function in your marketing function of your company. So complaints and feedback can come from anywhere, and particularly in this sort of social media oriented Web 2.0 and beyond world of ours. What are you going to tell your staff about how to keep an eye out for it? So that's part of quality management as well, as far as we're concerned. One more medical device label really quickly. That was the MHRA. And just to show that we do this is one of, again, in public domain, is that this is a client of ours. This is their label on their app. So hopefully that answers enough the questions of labels from other people.
A question from Berner, who, sorry if I said your name wrong. Hi, is the ref number from the the catalog number? I mean the model number.
You can make up whatever it is that's relevant. We normally put the ref number as the version number of the software. Like here, 3.7.1. See, there's a little mistake in this one that they've put their logo instead of ref by what should say ref. And actually there's a little mistake in the COVID app one as well, that they formatted the date wrong, but they're just minor stuff and you can tell what they mean. So
following up from that question, so Erica, this is quite an interesting one. The COVID one didn't actually have the day of release, but the 5 Lives one did. So Erica has asked, date of release, do you have to write the release day as in like the 26th, only the month and the year? Is that enough?
It's enough. Again, it's contextual. Is it enough? What's really the important one is the version number, really. Date of release is just something you have to do. So think of the software context. Which is more important for your developers to know to debug something? Which day it was released? Or, you know, or maybe it is which day it was released if you don't use some, say, semantic versioning to actually have some sort of x.y.z version number.
Perfect. And I think we've covered all the questions, so we can crack on.
Right, cracking on. Where's the rest of the presentation gone? Right, what was next?
Tech file build.
Yeah.
So take it over, Michael.
Yeah, please.
Perfect. So what exactly does technical documentation include? Now, the problem is we use the word technical file, so people think it's a file. It's not a file, it's a collection of files. So the terminology that we like to use is technical documentation. Makes it easier. Of course, the intended use statement that me and Mike were covering earlier on, that's the backbone of what you do, and that's there. Then, of course, you can have your compliance checklist. You know, if you want to go to the UK MDR, you want to make sure that you cover all the requirements for UK MDR. Likewise with EU MDR. Now, under EU MDR, there is basically GSPR, so General Safety and Performance Requirements, which is another one as well. Of course, GDPR, because we're dealing with medical devices, we're dealing with information, etc. There's GDPR. If you want to go to the US, there's going to be 510K, there's going to be de novos, there's going to be pre-market, etc. There's going to be special controls in some places, depending on the code of what your device actually is. So HIPAA, think of HIPAA like the GDPR equivalent for the US. And then, of course, anything that's state-specific, like we mentioned about California, effectively. Then we've got the clinical pieces, of course. We're going to have things like clinical evaluation plans, performance evaluation. So like I talked about earlier before, under the medical device, MDR is clinical evaluation. Under IVD is performance evaluation, but they're the same thing, just difference in terminology. And then we're going to have reports from that. Now, software-specific stuff, we're going to have software development plans, requirement specifications, architectural description. How exactly does it work? What does it speak to? There's going to be installation and configuration. If your device has to be installed, what is the set of instructions? Are there going to be different versions? Is it that people are going to have certain features turned on or turn off? What's going to be the maintenance of it, of course? And then, of course, the verification and validation. Risk management plans, reports, product requirements, risk registers effectively. But it's important to understand here when it comes to risk, you don't just want risk for your device. You also want risk for processes as well. So as part of your quality management system, what are the potential risk of your processes, not just the device? And then, of course, the post-market surveillance, we're going to have a plan. We're going to have post-market clinical follow-up. And then, of course, periodic safety update reports, PSUR, as part of the EU MDR as well. And again, what I put at the bottom as well, please remember, like I said, when I said put hands up, notified bodies are experiencing heavy backlogs. So if you are intending to release a medical device in the next year or two, that conversation really needs to start today with these notified bodies. Next slide, please, Mike. So Very important question. What changes can you make, especially with software? Because there's a lot of AI and machine learning in software, and it's constantly learning. And there's certain types of changes which are acceptable, certain type of changes which are substantial, and then certain type of changes which completely, you need to be a completely new device effectively. So minor changes are acceptable. You know, if you change little things like the color and the way that the font looks and things like that, maybe a slightly improved UX user interface, as long as it doesn't affect the intended use or claims, then you're okay. Now, if there's any risk that it may affect the intended use or claims, they are known as significant changes. And then you go to your notified body and you inform them of this. And then the notified body has two choices. They audit what they think is affected, or they turn around and say to you, you have to have a new submission altogether because you changed it so much to the point where it's basically a different device. Now, what can significant changes be? It could be to the intended purpose. It may be the design and performance. Sorry, go on ahead, Mike. It may be software changes. It may be material changes if you're physical, and sterilization. However, it depends on the type of the change and your notified body's opinion. So your notified body here is the decision maker. Next one, please, Mike. So here we are in terms of change control. How exactly do we do it in terms of every release? So we have planning, we have inputs, we have outputs, validation, and then of course, transfer. You want to take this over, Mike? You're more experienced in this.
So going back to the previous question about CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, why I said there's got to be a bit of ritual here is there needs to be consideration at every change. So every change we say logically consists of a number of feature requests. So people want new things or changes to things, or problem reports. Something has a bug in it and you want to change it as a result of something existing having a bug, not just wanting to change it because we've learned something new, perhaps. I want to add to it. So why we have trouble with the notion of continuous deployment is you do need to go through the thought process for each release. That here if you think in the sort of a particular agile language, you've got a product backlog. They're all the problem reports and feature requests that you have. Then you have a release backlog. These are all the things you're going to do for an identified, version 1. Say version 1.0.0 is the one you originally UKCAC marked. Now you want to make a version 1.1. What things are you actually going to put into the version 1.1 as opposed to the special case where everything on your product backlog is going to go into version 1.1? What do you really want to do? And this is why we've introduced a language of tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 changes, where if I go from the bottom upwards, tier 3 is things, small changes to the platform that you can't really see in the behavior. Like you realize through monitoring your virtual server, you're running out of virtual disk space, you need to upgrade it, or you need to specify another core or something. I don't know, silly things like that. Or on the user interface, typos, spelling mistakes that have got through, not really affecting the requirements so much. So you could do that, and we'd probably call that a version 1.0.1 change, a patch change, or a security patch to a component that doesn't really change the behavior otherwise. Tier 2 change, what changes the requirements of the software? So say you've created a new accuracy requirement. You've got from a 94% sensitivity, you need to be 96%, something like that. That's a tier 2 change. You need to re-verify, and this overlaps with, if you remember what to talk about, analytical validity of your software. You need to re-verify that your software can meet that. So maybe to meet that, you've added some training data to an AI deep learning model. So now you need to test with that training data, the various set points in it. Can you meet the accuracy? Can you draw the ROC curve? And are you still going to achieve or be superior to the accuracy spec you've set? So that's a re-verification. Tier 1 change is a potential revalidation. Have you changed a feature enough where you want to study if the clinical performance, so you haven't quite changed the intended use, in a bit of a gray area of some of these. Have you changed the clinical performance enough? Have you changed the user interface enough where you want to study again, can people use it safely, but without changing the intended use? That's a tier 1 change. So tier 2 change needs re-verification, tier 1 change needs revalidation. And then we get to tier 0 change. As Karen said, have you changed it so much that you've actually pretty much turned into a new device, which requires you to go back to your notified body, UK approved body, or for the US, go back to the FDA with a supplement to your clearance to say, actually, we've changed it so much, you need to look at this again, or you need to make the choice. Would you like to look at it again, or do you trust us as a manufacturer enough to just get on with it and treat it as a tier 1? So what's the conversation you've been reacting to in the... Yes, so Sharon, yeah, strictly speaking, changing a predictive model will be a significant change because you're changing the basic design of your product. But this is where we talked about this algorithm pre-specification and algorithm control protocols earlier. Someone asked a question about comes into it. I think what we try and do is create the argument for your quality management system with notified body that you are so good at specifying your product, you're so good at controlling the process, doing things like this, that's on the screen, that they will trust you until they come back for the next annual surveillance visit. So what if we do not replace the current language, but add a second language to the software? So that's a tier 1 change, potentially. Because I would say there's a validation of language comes in. So, clinical, technical language, you could be done, well, let's be very silly. You do it through Google Translate, comes out with hilarious things, but clinically and technically, are you actually really using the natural language in the proper way, using the terminology properly? So again, that's a tier 1 change because you cause potentially a validation that the instructions you give, can people still follow them in the same way that they did in your original language?
And the last one from Berner, so yeah, interface customization like colors and logos. In most cases, the answer is no, unless of course, you've got to look at other factors. Let's just say something like maybe your users are colorblind. In that case, if you start using different colors, it may change the way they interface with it. So in most cases, no, but there are some cases in which it may be considered a substantial change.
Yeah, or a tier 1 change at least. It's a change. It's not really changed intended purpose, but it's a change that requires revalidation. Can your users actually cope with the color combinations? And that's the typical case. If it's for colorblind people, or if it's for people who have some impairment of the hearing, if there's some audio component coming up the software, is it frequencies they can hear or not? Same sort of idea. Okay, what was next? So one of the things we try and do as well, again, going back and rounding off the software as a medical device into the overall ISO 13485 in American equivalent design control. And this goes back to why we plan release by release. We say things are iterative, and plan release by release is what ISO 13485 says is to release a product, you need to go through a sequence of phases, which are called planning and design input, design output, design verification, design validation, design transfer. So again, the question was asked earlier, what's the concept of design transfers? There's no design transfers of the software. And I think I said, yes, there is. And you can see that maybe again reflected here. What we're trying to say here is just what I said already, really. You might have an overall product backlog of things to do, but typically in iterative sort of agile software development, you have release backlogs. In between them, you have sprint backlogs as well. What do you do in each time box? But then you can, then you have a release. And again, a special case is that a release backlog and a sprint backlog are the same. You create one sprint, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, you go and do everything. But that everything has to include updating your requirements and your risk analysis. Have you introduced new risks or changed the risks by changing requirements, changing what you want this product, the software product to do? Design output, go and make the engineering changes, do the coding. And as we said, the unit acceptance criteria, do you need to peer review some of it? Do you need to style and force on it? Do you need to run unit tests? Design verification, then look at partial regression. What has changed? What do you need to regression test? What's new that you need to test for the first time? Design validation. have you caused anything? And the answer could be no, that requires revalidation with intended users. And then we go through the ritual of what we call the design review or the deployment readiness review. Are you as a company satisfied that what you've set out to do in that release has actually been done, and you can release a safe, effective, and cyber secure new version of your product? And then, as Karen Deep described, the loop at the bottom and deployment says, and you periodically review and periodically ask the same question: is what is on the market actually what you intended to do, and is it safe, effective, and cyber secure? This is where the post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up comes in and informs the requirements for your product. And that's why you go back to planning a new release periodically from the output of your PMS. Karen, please.
Yep, post-market surveillance. So we've touched onto this before. What exactly is post-market surveillance? So it's basically a structured process of monitoring safety and performance of the device once it's gone out into the market. Is it failing? Is it doing the job that it's supposed to be doing? Have you identified needs for improvement? Are there small bugs that maybe you haven't seen in it? What's the general feedback? Are people finding it more complicated? Are people suggesting things to you in terms of improving? But not just that. You also want to look at journals. You also want to look at professional publications and devices that are quite similar. And again, look at the modes of failure, look what your competitors are doing, and then maybe start putting preventative measures in to stop issues like that happening as well. Or maybe look to see what your competitors are doing and see maybe how you can improve your device. But obviously be careful. If you are making changes, is it a tier 1 change? Is it a substantial change? That's a decision that you need to make effectively. So under EU MDR, we got Article 83, which sort of talks about basically post-market surveillance. Every manufacturer is required to plan, establish, document, implement, and maintain and update a post-market surveillance system for every single medical device. And of course, that's funded. Erica, I've just seen question, FR and PR. So FR means a feature request, and PR means a problem report, i.e. something like a bug in your software. So that's what it means for SDLC. And yeah, that's what it is with post-market surveillance. Again, it's more about being proactive, really. Yeah, Mike, carry on.
Yeah.
And then risk management. So again, you've seen the term BSEN because it's a British standard. ISO 14971, again, Amendment 11, 2021, that's the one. So quickly just talk you through. So if you look on the right, look at your risk analysis. Have you noticed it starts with the intended use statement? So that's what we keep talking about it. Your intended use statement is where everything begins. It starts there. So once you know your intended use, you realize what is the foreseeable misuse. Who is the person that's going to be using it? Are they super qualified? Is it the lay user? And then straight away, you can start identifying the user risks. Once you've got that, you make a risk management plan. You start planning it. Okay, so these are the modes of failure. How are we going to do it? And then you have the requirements of risk register. What are the requirements, what you need to have, and what is basically the risk that comes with it. You then do a risk evaluation. So you evaluate what the risks are. Once that's in place, you effectively then have your risk control, because what you do is as far as possible, that's the terminology that we use. Risk can not in every single case always be completely eliminated. We try to reduce that risk as far as possible. That's what we basically do. And then, of course, once we got the risk controls, we got to look at the residual risk. Okay, we've controlled it. We've tried to bring it down as far as possible. Can we live with this risk? Or is this something that maybe we need to look into? Because there's always going to be a certain element of risk. Then, of course, we have a risk management review, which goes into a report. And then it goes into your final bits, your production and post-production activities, supply quality agreements. Now, for a lot of you companies out there who are making software, you're going to have a lot of outsourced suppliers. So you need to have agreements with them in place. Amazon, AWS, GitLab, etc. You're not going to get a specific tailored supply quality agreement. So then what you do is you look at their SLAs and all their T's and C's, as me and Mike have been finding quite strangely as well. Amazon, AWS, and Git, if you read their terms and conditions, they say they can revoke your access at any given time without telling you why. Hence why we always bang on about having a backup. So that's also a risk. Imagine you lose your code because you can't access these systems. So then what you do to mitigate that risk is either you download that code and you keep it on an internal server, or you keep it on a different platform provider effectively. And then, of course, you got your customer responsibility agreements, any product quality plans. What we mean by product quality plans is if you've got a physical product, you're not just strictly speaking software medical device. And then, of course, your post-market surveillance plan, which we talked about earlier effectively. So that's a quick overview of what risk management is.
And the other one, the bit of that we hope all these new companies get big enough to worry about, and I'm saying that slightly tongue-in-cheek, is a risk is also you're using GitHub for your source code. What are the credentials? Who could hack and hold you at ransom, or worse, fiddle with source code without you noticing, and it gets through your tests and your device doesn't behave correctly and causes patient harm? So that might be a bit far-fetched perhaps, but it is a risk that we cover. And having said that, strange thought, that's it. That's all we wanted to talk about today.
Thank you all for your time.
Any last questions before we go off and have a lie down at 11:54? Come on, 6 minutes. Get some in.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning, if anyone here didn't have the chance to answer questions or something, feel free to get in touch. You've seen mine and Mike's emails addresses there, so yeah, feel free to reach out.
Yeah.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Karen and Mike. Just while if there are any questions that crop up, perhaps you can address those. But just wanted to say a huge thank you, and to let everyone know, we will be including Mike and Karen Deet's email addresses in the post-event email, along with a recording, a link to the recording of today's session, along with a short feedback survey. So we'd be really grateful for any feedback you can provide. So just a quick flag, sessions 3 and 4 of this series are going to be at the same time on the next 2 consecutive Thursdays. So I hope to see you all there. The next session is going to cover health economics for software devices, and booking for both of these is still open on the events page of the HDR UK website. And a couple more things to flag, some more resources from the training team at HDR UK. I think my colleague James is going to pop some links in the chat. We have a monthly training newsletter that contains news and sort of relevant updates about our training and other training going on in the health data science space. So you can subscribe to that for free. Our virtual learning environment, Health Data Research Futures, also contains a growing library of free e-learning materials in health data science. And finally, you can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, both at HDR UK Learning. So I'll just hand back over in case Karen Deep might want to address any of those final questions. But from us, thanks very much for joining today, and I really hope you enjoyed the session.
I've got to say thank you very much to the audience. We have some very kind comments in the chat, which is terrific. We feel very gratified for that. 2 last questions in here, as we've got just a moment. As the first one. Question: tiers of change. How much to change clinical language and performance of AI models underlying a chatbot would count as 0 versus 1? I always say it depends. We're just asking that like that. It depends. And this is why we say at every prospective change, there's a structured way to do change impact analysis. You go through and say, what is it you propose to change? What's the narrative? How does it actually change the risks that you've registered? And then you can decide perhaps if it's a tier 0, tier 1, or tier 2. So, but then, you know, the thing to look at that then is where you go back to intended use. If you change the clinical language, perhaps, where it's language that only normally specialists in the field would interact with, it's possibly tier 0 because you change your intended users. If you've changed language that you can argue that specialists and generalists can use, it's a tier 1 potentially. So it depends. And the very last question is from Emma. Data often sits at the heart of medical device. Deep convolution neural networks and research are trained and validated in research data and consented and collected under public benefit. Well, here's a question. So I would say what you've done there is, if you remember I talked to you about technology readiness levels, you're being the tier 1 to 3 level. I think a bigger elephant in that room of the question you ask is perhaps how generalizable is your model from the demographic you've collected? So what we often find is that these research databases are limited either in the patient demographic or on the input equipment demographic, like, you know, what makes and models of scanners say, or what types of signal capture and analysis systems have been used. So to answer that, number one, the bigger question is how generalizable are you? Does that really, in research, have you thought about the intended use of the intended patient population fully to begin with, which might require you to go to another database and then come on to the point about consent. Where can you demonstrate that your data has been consented properly? Because you will, the FDA says it specifically in their regulations, more perhaps than the EU and the UK regulations. So any data you use, even if it's not for a neural network to use, think about it anyway, that's an enabling technology. Any data that you use to create anything, even if it's a human is doing the design of a decision tree, needs to be suitably consented for that use. So hopefully that answers that. Oh, and are there any more? So yeah, so data was collected from the place of intended use. All right, so is your intended use statement then only that place? So just to leave you with that thought.
Thanks very much, Mike. That's great. That brings us to time. So apologies if we didn't get to your questions today. You can direct an email to Michael Carandeep. And also, if you want to contact us, the training team at HDR UK, you can do so on learn@hdruk.ac.uk. Thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks again.
Thank you all.